Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Take a slow breath, settle into where you are, and let the shoulders drop a little. There is no hurry tonight, and nothing here that asks anything of you. Tonight we begin with 100 herbs, 100 plants from the old apothecary cupboards of medieval Europe, told one at a time, each in its quiet turn. We will start with the gentlest, the ones any cottage wife or village midwife would have known by sight, and walk slowly outward from there. From the simple chamomile and lavender of the kitchen garden into the bitter roots and resins kept on the upper shelf, and at last to the strange half-feared plants that lay behind the apothecary's iron grate, dispensed only with prayer. Imagine for a moment the quiet of an old apothecary at the close of day. The shutters are half drawn, the fire is low, a small lamp burns on the workbench, and the air smells of dried thyme and warm beeswax. The mortar and pestle have been wiped clean, and the tinctures sleep in dark glass on the long shelf. That is the pace I would like to keep tonight. Slow, even, steady as a soft rain on an old slate roof. We will turn now to the first herb. The first is chamomile. It is the small daisy-like flower of the European meadow, low to the ground, with feathery pale green leaves and a scent of ripe apples when it is bruised between the fingers. The Greeks gave it the name chamaemelon, meaning earth apple, for that very reason. It grows easily along old paths and on sunny banks, and has been gathered for so many centuries in so many places that it almost seems to follow people about, springing up in the worn footprints around a cottage door. In the apothecary, chamomile was kept in a clean linen bag. The flowers picked just as they opened, dried slowly in a dark loft. From there it was taken in a number of gentle ways. The most common was a simple infusion. A small handful of the dried heads in a pot, hot water poured over, a saucer placed on top, and the whole left to steep until the water turned the color of pale honey. This tea was given for restless evenings, for an upset stomach after too rich a supper, and to fretful children at bedtime. The flowers were also stitched into small pillows or boiled and added to a warm bath in the hour before sleep. There is a quiet record from the chalk villages of Sussex of midwives keeping a chamomile pot warming on the hearth through long labours, sipping a little themselves and offering it to the mother between the slow waves. When the great herbalist John Gerard wrote about chamomile in the closing years of the 16th century, he said simply that it was good for all that ailed the head when worn down by long care. Let us turn now to the second herb. The second is lemon balm. It is a soft, bushy plant of the mint family, with crinkled green leaves that release a clean, lemony scent when stroked between the fingers. The Greeks called it Melissa, the bee, because the bees so loved its small white flowers that beekeepers would rub it inside an empty hive to coax a new swarm to settle. From that single habit came centuries of care for the herb. Every monastery garden of any note, from southern Italy to the abbeys of the Rhine, kept a thick clump of melissa near the hives. In the apothecary's hand, the leaves were used fresh wherever possible. A simple infusion of crushed leaves in hot water was given for nervous headaches, for a sour stomach, and for what the old texts called the heart fluttering that comes upon people in seasons of grief. A stronger preparation, the famous Carmelite water of the 17th century friars in Paris, combined lemon balm with lemon peel, angelica root, nutmeg, and a little cinnamon, all steeped in spirit for several weeks and then strained through fine linen. A spoonful in warm water was taken before bed for a restless mind. The Persian physician Avicenna, writing in the 11th century, said of Melissa that it made the heart merry and drove away dark thoughts. The English clergyman John Hussey, who lived to a great age in the 17th century, was said to drink lemon balm tea every morning of his long life. Let us turn now to the third.
The third is lavender.
It is the small, woody, blue-grey shrub of the southern hills, sending up tall, slender spikes of violet flowers in the heat of summer. The name comes from the Latin lavare, to wash, for the Romans used it to scent the water of their public baths. They carried it across the empire, and where the legions went, lavender came to grow on the dry, stony banks beside the roads. By the early Middle Ages, it had settled deep into the gardens of Provence, of Tuscany, and of the warmer corners of southern England. In the Apothecary, lavender was kept in two forms. The dried buds were stored loose in linen bags for laying among bed linens and in the wardrobes of the well-kept household. The distilled water of the flowers was kept in a small dark bottle on a high shelf, drawn out only a few drops at a time. It was used to rub into the temples of those troubled by megrim headaches, to settle a faintness, and to ease the trembling of those who had taken too much fright. A few drops on the pillow were said to soften a fearful night for a child. In the convents of Provence, the nuns of the Carmelite order are said to have woven lavender into the small pillows given to weary pilgrims at the end of a long road. To this day, in the south of France, you may walk past a kitchen door at dusk and catch the scent of a small posy hung above the lintel. We will turn now to the fourth. The fourth is valerian. It is a tall, slender plant of the damp wood edge, with feathery green leaves and small clusters of pale pink flowers. The root, however, has another character entirely. Once dug from the cool ground in autumn and laid out to dry, it gives off the strong, earthy odor of an old cellar, somewhere between turned earth and warm leather. To some it is unpleasant. To cats, who roll upon it with great delight, it is the finest perfume in the world. The valerian root has been a quiet staple of the cupboard for a very long time. The Greek physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century, called it foo and prescribed it for those who could not be still. In the Middle Ages, it was the trusted helper for sleeplessness, for the long unease that comes upon a person under strain, and for the nervous trembling of the limbs. The standard preparation was a slow, cold infusion. The dried, chopped root was placed in a stoneware jug, cool water poured upon it, and the whole left to stand from morning until evening. By candlelight, a small cup was strained off and given to the sleepless one, often with a little honey to take the edge off the taste. In the cloisters of medieval Saxony, the brothers kept a strict little ledger of valerian root used in the infirmary, and the entries climbed steeply through every long winter. Let us turn now to the fifth. The fifth is the hop. It is a long, twining vine, climbing the hedges and the woodland edges in a great rush of summer growth. The leaves are broad and rough to the touch, the flowers small green cones, soft as crepe paper with a sticky golden dust hidden inside the bracts. That sticky dust is the strength of the herb, and it carries a warm, resinous scent that lingers on the fingers long after the cone is set down. The hop was already known to the Pisan and Bavarian monastic brewers by the early centuries of the second millennium. Its bitterness preserved the wort, and its calm steadied the drinker. The great medieval abbess Hildegard of Bingen wrote of it in the 12th century in her work on the natures of plants, and recommended it carefully to those whose minds were given to nighttime worry. Country wives sewed dried hops into small linen pillows, sometimes with lavender and chamomile, and laid these beneath the heads of restless sleepers. The strong, cold infusion of the hops was drunk in small cups for stubborn insomnia and for the nervous indigestion that follows a heavy day. The English King George III, in his troubled later years, is said to have rested at last upon a hop pillow brought up from a Kentish farm. Let us now turn to the sixth. The sixth is the linden flower. It comes from the great spreading lime tree of the European avenues and village squares, the tilia of the Romans, the tilleul of the French, the lipa of the Slavs. In the long days of late June and early July, the tree breaks out into a soft cloud of pale yellow blossoms, and for a few weeks the bees gather there in such numbers that the whole tree seems to hum. Once dried, they were kept in clean glass jars and used for a soft, sweet infusion. A pinch of the dried flowers in a cup of hot water gave a tea the color of pale tea-stained linen, with a faint scent of honey, very pleasant to the tongue. The linden tea was given to children with the small fevers that come and go in the cooler seasons, to those troubled by a cold settling on the chest, and to the elderly who could not find their way to sleep. In the Norman villages, it was the mother's first remedy for a fretful baby. Charlemagne, in the 8th century, ordered the planting of linden trees in many of his royal estates, both for the shade they gave to the hayfields and for the soft yellow blossoms gathered each summer for the sick. Let us turn now to the seventh herb. The seventh is mugwort. It is a tall, dusty grey weed of the roadsides and waste ground, sending up long stalks of small grey-green leaves and tight clusters of pale flowers in the late part of summer. To the touch they are dry and slightly bitter, and the scent is dry and herbal, somewhere between sage and old hay. The Greeks named the genus Artemisia after the goddess Artemis, who they said had given it as a gift to the centaur Chiron. In the Apothecary, mugwort was a herb of long, careful tradition. It was kept dried in linen bags and used for several quiet purposes. A weak infusion of the leaves was taken to settle a sluggish digestion, to bring on a delayed cycle in young women, and to ease the discomforts of long travel on foot. A pillow stuffed with the dried leaves was said to bring vivid, calm dreams. The Anglo-Saxon herbal known as the lachnunga, copied out around the year 1000, sings to mugwort in a long charm that begins with the words, "Remember, mugwort, what you made known." On St. John's Eve, the eve of the summer solstice, country folk would weave a girdle of mugwort around their waists and sit by the bonfire, and at the end of the night they would throw the girdle into the embers, that all the troubles of the year might burn away with it. Travellers tucked a sprig into the lining of their shoes against weariness. Let us turn now to the eighth. The eighth is vervain. It is a slender, modest plant of the dry banks and old churchyards, sending up tall, thin stems with widely spaced pairs of small, pale lilac flowers. To pass it on a roadside, you might not notice it at all, and yet for several thousand years vervain has been one of the most reverenced herbs in all of European tradition. The Romans called it the holy plant, and the soldiers of the legions believed that to carry a sprig of vervain into battle was to come safely home again. In the apothecary, the dried herb was kept in clean linen and used in a number of gentle ways. A weak infusion was given for the small, lingering headaches that follow long worry. A salve was made by simmering the herb in lard and used upon bruises and sprains. A few drops of the distilled water were rubbed upon the temples of one who could not settle to sleep. The Druids of Roman Britain are said to have gathered vervain only at the dark of the moon, with a small offering of honey set at the base of the plant. The medieval English wise women hung sprigs of it above the cradle of a newborn child, that the child might grow up gentle and unafraid. It is, by the testimony of 10 centuries, a herb of quiet protection. Let us turn now to the 9th.
The 9th is wood betony.
It is a small, neat plant of the woodland edges and the chalky meadows, sending up a single slender stem topped with a tight head of soft purple flowers. The leaves are dark green, almost crinkled, and held close to the ground in a tidy rosette. In the long catalogues of Old English herb gardens, betony was nearly always present, often planted in the corners and beside the paths, where it could be reached without trampling other beds. The medieval apothecaries kept this Roman tradition alive. They dried the leaves, packed them in small linen bags, and prepared a simple infusion for those troubled by long-standing headaches, bad dreams, and the kind of lingering low spirits that follows a hard winter. There is a fine line in an Anglo-Saxon herbal that says betony is good for a man's soul as well as for his body, by which the writer most likely meant that a calmed head allows a calmer heart. In monastic gardens, betony was planted in the cemetery as well as in the infirmary, and a sprig was sometimes laid in the hands of the dying as a quiet last comfort. Let us turn now to the 10th. The 10th is skullcap. It is a slender, wiry plant of the wet meadows and stream banks, with small, pale blue flowers shaped, as the old herbalists noticed, very like the helmets worn by foot soldiers in the Middle Ages. From that resemblance came the common name. The leaves are narrow, the flowers come in pairs along the upper stem, and the whole plant stands no higher than a walking stick. In the apothecary, the dried leaves and flowering tops were used together. They were stripped from the stem, dried in a cool, airy loft, and stored in linen sacks until needed. The standard preparation was a gentle infusion in hot water, given 1/4 cup at a time, 2 or 3 times in the course of a long evening. It was the herb of choice for those who could not steady the hand, for the unease that comes after a fright, and for the small, repeating nervous twitches that visit the elderly in their last winters. A simple cup of skullcap and chamomile, taken slowly each evening, was credited with bringing many such travellers back to themselves. Let us turn now to the 11th. The 11th is passion flower. This one is a relative latecomer to the European cupboard, for it is a vine of the warm forests of the Americas and reached the apothecaries of the Old World only in the wake of the Spanish friars. They named it the passion flower because the strange, intricate blossom seemed to them to bear all the symbols of the Passion of Christ, the crown of thorns and the 3 nails and the 5 wounds, set into a single complicated bloom. The simple medieval-style preparation that emerged was a gentle infusion of the dried leaves and flowers in warm water, sweetened a little with honey and drunk in the quiet hour before bed. It was given to those whose minds would not stop turning, to women in the trying years near the change of life, and to old men troubled by nighttime worry. The herb arrived late in the cupboard, but was welcomed easily, for it sat well with the older European herbs of quiet sleep. Let us turn now to the 12th. The 12th is catmint. It is a soft, grey-leafed plant of the cottage garden, sending up loose spikes of small lavender flowers in the warmer months. The leaves carry a slightly minty, slightly musky scent that house cats find utterly irresistible. They roll upon the plant, paw at it, and lie in long contented stupors beneath its drooping stems. From this long-noted feline affection came the kindly old country name. In the Apothecary, catmint was a gentle herb, kept on the lower shelves and used freely. The dried leaves and flowers were prepared as a soft infusion and given especially to children. It was the country mother's first remedy for the colicky baby, for the child fretful with teething, and for the slightly older child who could not settle to sleep. A weak warm cup, sweetened with a little honey, was reckoned to ease the small body without disturbing it. In the cottage tradition of medieval England, the herb was sown around the kitchen herb bed as a quiet protection of the place. There is something quite agreeable in the thought that a sleeping cat upon a sunny windowsill, breathing slow against the dust, has been a sign of a peaceful house for a very long time indeed. Let us turn now to the 13th. The 13th is wild lettuce. The leaves are long and softly toothed, and when broken they weep a sticky, milky white sap. That sap is the strength of the herb. The Greek physician Dioscorides, writing in the 1st century, noted its calm, sleep-giving properties and called it lettuce opium. In the Apothecary, wild lettuce was harvested in the long days of summer when the plant ran to flower. The cut stems were drained of their milky sap into shallow earthenware dishes. The dried sap formed a brown, brittle gum which was crumbled into preparations as needed. It was milder by far than the true poppy, and it was the gentle helper of the cupboard for those whose pain was less than great but whose sleep was thin. A common preparation was a small dose of the dried sap, dissolved in warm water with a little honey, taken late in the evening. It is a herb of patient, slow comfort. Let us turn now to the 14th. The 14th is the California poppy. This one, like the passion flower, arrived in the European cupboard only in later centuries, for it is the bright orange wildflower of the dry hills of the American West. The Franciscan friars, who walked up the long coast of California to found their missions in the 17th and 18th centuries, were keen botanists. They learned from the local indigenous peoples that this small four-petaled flower, gathered along the trails, was a calmer of restlessness and a gentle help for sleep. The preparation followed a familiar pattern. The whole flowering plant was gathered as it bloomed, cut close to the ground, hung in small bundles from rafters and dried in the warm shadows of the mission storerooms. The dried herb was made into a simple infusion in hot water, sweetened with honey, and drunk in small cups in the evening. Children were given a milder dilution, The friars wrote with quiet approval that the herb was kindly and did not stupefy. Although the California poppy did not find its way into the great medieval herbals of Europe, by the 19th century it had taken its quiet place in the apothecary cupboards of Madrid and of London, often listed with the other gentle calmers from the New World. It joins the cupboard with passion flower and with one or two of the cohoches we will meet later, as part of the slow Atlantic exchange of herbal knowledge. Let us turn now to the 15th.
The 15th is saffron.
These are the slender red threads taken from the heart of the autumn flowering crocus. The Crocus sativus, a small purple bloom no larger than a thumb. From this rarity came the herb's old name in the Arabic of the Levant, Zafaran, the golden one. In the medieval cupboard, saffron sat in a small, tightly sealed glass on the upper shelf, parted with sparingly. Its preparation was simple. A few threads were dropped into warm water or warm milk and stirred until the liquid took on a deep amber color. This warm cup was given to the heavy-hearted, to those recovering from long illness, and to women in the long melancholy that sometimes follows childbirth. Far to the east, in the apothecaries of Persia and Andalusia, saffron was woven into so many preparations that an old proverb said no apothecary was worthy of the name who could not afford a small jar of it on his shelf. Let us turn now to the 16th.
The 16th is borage.
It is a tall, rough-leafed annual of the cottage garden, with a single sturdy stem, broad hairy leaves, and small clusters of bright blue five-pointed flowers that hang downward like little stars. The bees adore it. The leaves, when crushed, smell faintly of cucumber, cool and clean, and the flowers eaten whole taste sweet upon the tongue. The Romans were the first to plant it widely, calling it borago, and giving it the name ego borago gaudia semper ago, by which they meant, I, borage, always bring joy. The medieval apothecaries inherited this Roman fondness. Borage was kept fresh in the kitchen, in the herbalist's cooking pot, and dried in the cupboard for the cold months. Its blue flowers were floated upon the cordials given to the heavy-hearted, and the leaves were brewed into a simple infusion for those weakened by long fevers. It was the herb the apothecary called for when the sick needed not so much a cure as a small return of cheer. The English herbalist John Gerard, writing in the late 16th century, repeated the old Latin verse and added that borage drives away all sadness and dullness. There is something rather kind in a herb whose only true purpose, after all the centuries of saying it, is to lift a fallen spirit. Let us turn now to the 17th. The 17th is rosemary. It is the small, woody, evergreen shrub of the southern hillsides, with narrow, dark green leaves, fragrant as pine and cedar combined, and small, pale blue flowers in the cool weeks of spring. The Romans called it Ros marinus, the dew of the sea, for it grew most thickly along the coastal cliffs where the salt mist settled at night. From there it travelled north with the legions and the friars, until by the late Middle Ages it was found in the gardens of every monastery and most cottages of the southern half of Europe. In the apothecary, rosemary was kept as dried sprigs, hung head down from the rafters in tight bundles. It was used in many ways. A simple infusion of the leaves was given for the dull headache that follows poor sleep, for a sluggish digestion, and for what the old texts called the heaviness of the limbs. A salve of rosemary and lard was rubbed upon stiff joints. A bath of the leaves in warm water was prepared for those weary of long travel. From far older days, the Roman students of the academies wore rosemary garlands at their examinations, for it was reckoned to strengthen the memory. Even now, that ancient association remains alive in the proverb, rosemary for remembrance. Let us turn now to the 18th. The 18th is sage. It is a low, grey-green, woody shrub of the warm Mediterranean hills, with broad, slightly furred leaves and tall spikes of small purple flowers in the early summer. The Latin name salvia comes from salvare, to save, and the herb has carried that connection with healing for nearly 2,000 years. The verses of the Salerno Medical School, written around the year 1000, sang of sage in a now famous line, Cur moriatur homo, qui salvia crescit in horto. Why should a man die when sage grows in his garden? This was no idle praise. The medieval apothecaries kept dried sage close at hand for many things. A simple infusion of the leaves was given for sore throats and for the small fevers of the changing season. A strong gargle of sage and a little salt was used for sore mouths and for the healing of small ulcers within the cheek. The Roman physician Galen prescribed sage in warm wine to aged senators of fading appetite. There is a certain quiet integrity in a herb that simply gently lifts the body just enough to keep going for one more season. Let us turn now to the 19th. The 19th is hyssop. It is a small, low, woody plant of the dry, stony hillsides with narrow, dark green, slightly leathery leaves and tall, narrow spikes of deep blue flowers in the heat of the summer. To break a leaf is to release a strong, clean, slightly camphorous, slightly minty scent, sharper than rosemary, deeper than mint. The Hebrew word ezoph, from which the English hyssop comes, is mentioned several times in the Old Testament as a herb of cleansing. In the Apothecary, hyssop was used for the chest, for the breath, and for the long, stubborn, dry coughs of the cold months. The dried leaves and flowering tops were stored in linen, and a simple infusion was prepared in hot water, sweetened with honey. The hot, clean breath of the rising vapor was breathed in over the cup before drinking, that the chest might open a little. A syrup of hyssop and honey, slowly simmered, was kept in small earthenware jars and given by the spoonful to children with winter chest rasps. The Persian apothecaries of the medieval period included hyssop in many of their breath-easing electuaries, often with cinnamon and a little cardamom. Let us turn now to the 20th. The 20th is thyme. It is a tiny, low, woody plant of the chalk downs and the dry, stony slopes, hugging the earth in a dense grey-green carpet, sending up small clusters of pink or pale lilac flowers in the early summer. The scent, released by the smallest brush of the hand, is sharp and warm, full of the memory of southern hillsides at noon. The Greeks gave it the name thymos, by which they meant courage of spirit. In the apothecary, dried thyme was kept on the lower shelves, ready for the long winter months when the chest is most prone to seizing up. A simple infusion of the dried leaves was given for the cough that follows a damp night, for hoarseness of the voice, and for the weariness of one who has come in cold from the road. A few drops of the distilled oil in a little warm water were used as a gargle for the sore mouth. The medieval women of the Crusader households would weave a small sprig of thyme into the scarves of their departing knights. that the warm, clean scent might travel with them all the way to Acre. The shepherds of southern France, at the end of a long day on the high pastures, would crush a handful of the dried herb into the warm coals of the fire and breathe in the rising smoke for a tired chest. Let us turn now to the 21st.
The 21st is marjoram.
It is a small, soft, low-growing herb of the warm hills, very close in habit to oregano, but gentler in scent and milder on the tongue. The leaves are pale green, almost grey, slightly furred, and the small white flowers come in soft knotted clusters at the tips of the stems. The Greeks gave it the name amaracus, and the early herbal tradition tells the story that the plant first sprang up where the goddess Aphrodite touched a young serving boy upon the brow. In the Apothecary, marjoram sat near the kitchen herbs and was treated kindly. A simple infusion of the dried leaves was given to ease a sluggish digestion after a long meal, to settle a headache that follows a bright day, and to soothe the small disquiet of one who has had bad news but is not yet ready to weep. A sachet of the dried herb was placed beneath the pillow of one who could not sleep, and a few of the flowers were tucked into the dowry chests of the southern brides as a quiet blessing on the long marriage to come. In the convents of Burgundy, the herbalist sisters made small marjoram pillows for the bedrooms of the novices in their first year, that the young women might sleep gently while they grew into their new lives. Let us turn now to the 22nd.
The 22nd is oregano.
It is the wild cousin of marjoram, a sturdier, stronger tasting herb of the open mountain pastures with the same small leaves, the same low woody habit, but a deeper, sharper, more savory scent that can fill an entire kitchen from a single dried bunch. The Greek name oreganos means joy of the mountain, and any shepherd who has crossed a Cretan or Calabrian hillside in late summer knows the truth of it. In the Apothecary, dried oregano was hung from the rafters and used freely. A simple hot infusion was given for the cold that has settled into the chest, for the digestive trouble that follows a heavy supper, and for the toothache that comes from a small infection in the gum. A poultice of warmed oregano and hot bread was laid upon a stiff neck. The Persian physicians of the medieval period used a strong oregano gargle for sore throats, and the women of the Greek islands have, for as long as anyone can remember, kept a pot of dried oregano beside the salt and the olive oil on the kitchen shelf, treating it as both kitchen herb and quiet medicine. Let us turn now to the 23rd. The 23rd is pennyroyal. It is the smallest of the mints, a low, creeping plant of the damp meadow corners with pale lilac flowers in tight whorls along its trailing stems. To brush against it is to release a sharp, almost peppery mint scent far stronger than the kitchen mint, with a hint of menthol and a faint bitterness underneath. The Latin name Palladium comes from Pulex, the flea, for the herb was strewn in the rushes of medieval houses to drive that small, persistent pest from the floor. In the Apothecary, pennyroyal was kept on a higher shelf and parted with carefully. The dried leaves were stored in linen, and a weak infusion was given for the cold that goes through one in damp weather, for the small headache that comes with a delayed cycle, and for the sluggish digestion after a heavy stew of mutton. A poultice of warm pennyroyal in oil was laid upon the side for the dull ache of the lower back. The herbalists of the Anglo-Saxon period, the shapers of the Lacnunga, listed pennyroyal among the women's herbs, and they were watchful with it. They knew that this small mint, in too strong a dose, could trouble a delicate body more than it helped. In the careful tradition of the cupboard, pennyroyal was always given in small, weak preparations by an experienced hand, and never to a woman with child. The herb, like several others we shall meet, was kept carefully and respected. Let us turn now to the 24th. The 24th is peppermint. It is the tall, upright mint of the cool stream banks and the cottage herb beds, with dark green, sharply toothed leaves and small, pale lilac flowers in the late summer. The leaf between the fingers gives off the cool, clean, deep scent that we know almost too well today, but for which the medieval cupboard was, in fact, only just beginning to find a place. The plant we now call peppermint is most likely a chance hybrid that arose in English gardens in the late Middle Ages and was brought into careful cultivation in the 17th century. In the apothecary, the dried leaves were kept in clean linen, and a simple, fragrant infusion was prepared in hot water. This was given for the heaviness in the stomach after a too rich meal, for the headache that follows a long ride on a cold day, and for the small queasiness of women in the early weeks of expectation, where it was thought to settle the body without disturbing it. There is in this herb an old, calm reliability. Let us turn now to the 25th. The 25th is spearmint. It is the older, gentler cousin of the peppermint, the mint of the ancient world, the mint named in the writings of Pliny and of Dioscorides. Its leaves are narrower, brighter green, less sharply minty, and there is a softness to its scent that is closer to garden than to medicine cabinet. The Romans wove it into garlands at their wedding feasts, calling it the herb of welcome, and the Greeks scattered it freely upon the floors of their banqueting halls, that the air might be fresh underfoot. In the apothecary, spearmint was the kitchen mint, and the gentle stomach herb kept on the lower shelves and given freely. A simple infusion of the fresh or dried leaves was made in hot water, sweetened lightly, and given to settle a queasy belly, to ease a slight headache, and to refresh those returning from a long day in the dust. The herbalist often grew it close to the door of the still room, that a few leaves might always be picked at the moment they were needed. The medieval cookery books of the Italian and English households call upon spearmint in many sauces, for lamb, for peas, for new young carrots in the spring. There is a small note in a 13th century manuscript from Bologna that describes a country wife slipping a sprig of spearmint into the bath of her tired husband at the end of a haymaking day. It is the kind of detail that lets you see just for a moment how very old and very ordinary the gentleness of this herb has always been. Let us turn now to the 26th.
The 26th is fennel.
It is a tall, feathery plant of the warm hillside and the cottage edge, with fine, bright green leaves like soft green smoke and broad, flat-topped clusters of small yellow flowers in the late summer. The Romans called the plant foeniculum, the little hay, and they planted it everywhere they went, so that to this day fennel grows wild along old Roman roads from northern Spain to the Welsh border. In the apothecary, fennel seed was kept in glass jars on the middle shelf and used very freely. A simple infusion of a teaspoon of crushed seed in hot water was given for a colicky belly, for the wind that troubles the elderly after supper, and for the heavy chest of one who has caught cold in damp weather. The seeds were also chewed dry after a meal to sweeten the breath and to settle the stomach. A weak fennel water was given to nursing mothers with poor milk, and a poultice of warm fennel was laid on tired eyes. The cooks of the Salerno school sweetened their digestive cordials with fennel and a little honey, and the country mothers of the Norman valleys gave a few seeds in warm milk to teething babies. Let us turn now to the 27th. The 27th is anise. It is a slender annual of the warm, sheltered garden, with delicate feathery leaves and small white umbels that ripen by autumn into the small, oval, sweet-tasting seeds we know today. The mathematician and philosopher Pythagoras, writing in the 6th century before Christ, said that anise bread taken every morning would lengthen a life and steady a mind. In the Apothecary, anise seed was kept in clean glass beside the fennel, and the two were often used together. A simple infusion of crushed anise seed in hot water was given to colicky babies, to old men with windy bellies, and to those troubled by a small repeating cough that would not leave them. The seeds were also chewed at the close of a long supper, to settle the stomach and to sweeten the breath. In the Italian apothecaries, a slow syrup was prepared each autumn by simmering the dried seeds with honey and a little wine, and stored in stoneware for the long winter coughs of children. There is something in the warm, soft sweetness of anise that has always belonged to small acts of comfort. Let us turn now to the 28th. The 28th is caraway. It is a slender biennial plant of the cool meadows and roadside banks, with finely cut feathery leaves and small white flowers in flat, low umbels. The seeds, when ripe, are small, narrow, slightly curved, and ridged with a warm, faintly sweet, faintly peppery aroma when chewed. The English name comes through Old French and Old Spanish from the Arabic carawaya. The herb was carried into Europe in the great medieval trade of seeds and spices through the merchants of Cairo and Damascus. In the Apothecary, caraway sat with the other warming seeds, the fennel and the anise on the middle shelf. The dried seeds were used freely. An infusion was given for a sluggish digestion, for the colicky baby, and for the persistent gas that troubles the very young and the very old. The seeds were chewed slowly at the end of a long meal. They were also baked into the small wedding cakes of Central and Northern Europe, for the old country wisdom held that caraway taken at the wedding feast would help the new couple to remain faithful to one another. It is a quiet, kindly seed. Let us turn now to the 29th. The 29th is dill. It is a tall, slender annual of the warm garden bed, with feathery blue-green leaves of an almost ghost-like softness, and small, flat-topped umbels of yellow flowers that ripen into the dried, ridged seeds we know today. The Romans called it anethum and grew it widely. In the Apothecary, dill was a herb of small kindnesses. A simple infusion of the seeds in hot water, sweetened with a little honey, was the standard nursery remedy for the colicky baby and for the child kept awake by wind in the belly. A weak infusion of the leaves was given to nursing mothers, for the old herbalists believed dill water would steady the milk and calm the infant in turn. The dried umbels were tucked into linen sachets and laid in the cradle, that the small one might sleep softly. In the Anglo-Saxon village tradition, dill was hung above the door of a house where a witch's evil was suspected to be passing by, for the herb was said to draw away the bad word and let only kind ones through. It is one of the very few plants of the cupboard whose entire long career has been spent in the service of small, fretful, sleepy beings. Let us turn now to the 30th. The 30th is coriander. It is an annual of the warm garden, sending up bright green, rounded lower leaves and finer, lacy upper leaves, with small white-pink umbels that ripen into round, ridged seeds with a sweet, faintly orange skin scent. The herb is among the oldest of the cultivated medicines of the Mediterranean. Coriander seeds have been recovered from the burial chambers of the New Kingdom pharaohs, including from the tomb of Tutankhamun, where small clay pots of the seed were laid for use in the next world. In the apothecary, the dried seeds were kept on the middle shelf. A simple infusion of the seeds in hot water was given for the windy belly, for the slight headache that follows a heavy meal, and for the small queasiness of long travel. A few seeds were chewed at the end of a meal to sweeten the breath. The Italian apothecaries of the Salerno school included coriander in their winter cordials and their long-keeping electuaries. The Egyptian Ebers papyrus, written around the year 1500 before Christ, lists coriander among its remedies for the sluggish belly and the heavy head. The Roman gourmet Apicius includes it in many of his sauces. The medieval Persian apothecaries of Baghdad and Isfahan made small candied coriander seeds, the sugar-coated comfits, and these were given to children at the end of long meals to sweeten both the breath and the temper. The herb has, for at least 4,000 years, been small, friendly, and forgiving. Let us turn now to the 31st. The 31st is cumin. It is a delicate, low annual of the dry garden, with finely divided leaves and small white-pink umbels that ripen into the long, narrow, ridged seeds whose deep, warm, slightly bitter aroma anyone who has stepped into a Levantine spice market has carried home in memory. The seed has been gathered in the lands of the eastern Mediterranean for at least 4,000 years, and Roman writers from Pliny onward give it a respectful place among the household medicines of the Italian peninsula. In the apothecary, cumin sat beside the coriander and the caraway kept in clean linen parted with by the spoonful. A simple infusion of the dried seeds in hot water was given for sluggish digestion, for the cold belly, and for the slight nausea that comes with the change of season. The seeds were also baked into small loaves of bread for the Crusader soldiers and the merchants of the caravan routes, for old country law held that cumin, taken at every meal, would keep a traveler from becoming faithless on a long journey from home. The Egyptian apothecaries had used cumin for at least 2,000 years before him for digestive ease. The medieval Saxon herbalists called it Simon, and listed it among the 18 pleasant household herbs to be kept always in the cupboard. Let us turn now to the 32nd. The 32nd is Angelica. It is the great, towering biennial of the damp garden, sending up a hollow, ridged stem to a man's shoulder, topped with broad, rounded umbels of small green-white flowers and broad, bright green leaves. The whole plant has a clean, faintly resinous, faintly licorice scent, and the long, fleshy taproot dug in the second autumn is one of the most prized medicinal roots of all of Christian Europe. The English name comes from the medieval belief that the herb was first revealed to a hermit by the archangel Michael as a defense against the great pestilence of the year 348. In the apothecary, dried angelica root was kept in linen and used very widely. A strong decoction of the chopped root was given for the cold settling on the chest, for the failing appetite of one recovering from long fever, and for the nervous exhaustion that comes from too many short nights. A small piece of the root, slowly chewed, was carried into plague houses by visiting physicians as a quiet protection. A confit of candied angelica was kept in glass jars for the convalescent, both for cheer and for the slow strengthening of the body. The plague-time apothecaries of 14th century Marseille were said to have walked through the worst streets of the city with a wax-sealed lozenge of angelica root tucked under the tongue, breathing through it as through a mask of long faith. Let us turn now to the 33rd. The 33rd is lovage. It is a tall, dark, green, vigorous perennial of the cool kitchen garden, very like a great wild celery in habit, with broad, ribbed stems, divided, shining leaves, and small yellow umbels of flowers in the second summer. The whole plant carries a strong, warm, slightly resinous celery scent, and the dried root, lifted in autumn, was one of the trusted medicines of the Benedictine and Cistercian kitchens of the Middle Ages. The Latin name levisticum may come from an older ligusticum, the Ligurian, for the herb was said to grow especially well in those northern Italian hills. In the apothecary, dried lovage root was kept in linen on the middle shelf, and the leaves were used fresh from the garden whenever possible. A decoction of the root was given for sluggish digestion, for the heavy chest of one who had caught cold in damp travelling, and for the dropsical swelling of the legs in the elderly. A poultice of crushed leaves was laid on stiff joints. A weak infusion of the seeds was given for the gripping of the belly that follows a too rich winter meal. In the Cistercian monastery gardens of northern France, lovage was planted in the long bed by the kitchen door and was ladled fresh and hot into the broth pots of the brothers' suppers each evening of the year. Let us turn now to the 34th.
The 34th is wormwood.
It is a tall, silvery, aromatic shrub of the dry hillside and the abandoned field, sending up many slender stems clothed in finely cut, ash-grey leaves and small drooping clusters of pale yellow flowers in the late summer. The whole plant carries a deep, dry, persistent bitterness that has lent the genus its name, Artemisia absinthium, and given European languages a long line of bitter words. The Greeks called it absinthian, and Pliny the Elder said no other herb so plainly cleared the head of long worry. In the apothecary, wormwood was kept in linen on the middle shelf and used sparingly. The dried leaves and tops were used for several quiet purposes. A weak infusion was given as a bitter tonic to those whose appetite had failed after long illness, for the worms that troubled the bellies of country children, and for the languid digestion of the very old. A washing of the floors of the sick room with wormwood water was reckoned to drive fleas and small biting things from the rushes. In the late medieval German monasteries, the brewing of a small green wormwood liqueur was a careful task assigned only to the senior brothers, and the bottles were given out by the spoonful to those returning weak from a long fast or a hard journey on the icy roads. Let us turn now to the 35th. The 35th is tansy. It is a tall, sturdy perennial of the meadow edge and the abandoned cottage garden, with finely cut, dark green leaves and tight, button-like clusters of bright yellow flowers in the late summer. The whole plant carries a sharp, bitter, slightly camphorous scent that lingers long on the hand. The Greek name Tanacetum comes from a thanaton, meaning unfading, for the dried flowers keep their bright yellow color through many winters in the apothecary's jar. In the apothecary, tansy was kept in linen on the upper shelf and parted with carefully. The dried herb was used as a bitter tonic for the worms that troubled the bellies of country children, and as a wash for the floors of houses where small biting pests had become a nuisance. A weak infusion of the leaves was given in spring as a cleansing tonic for the body grown sluggish through a winter of dark bread and salted meat. In medieval England, the small, bright yellow Easter pudding of the country households, made of eggs, breadcrumbs, and a green juice of tansy and other spring herbs, was eaten on the first Sunday after Lent, for the old wisdom said that this slightly bitter mouthful prepared the body for the long warm season ahead. The English herbalist John Gerard, writing in the late 16th century, said simply that tansy is a herb of long usefulness and short danger, by which he meant kindly enough in the right dose, and not to be played with in too generous a one. Let us turn now to the 36th. The 36th is rue. It is a small, woody, greyish perennial of the warm garden corner with neat, divided blue-green leaves of a slightly succulent kind and small yellow flowers in summer. The whole plant carries a strong, sharp, sour, almost goaty smell that some find unpleasant and that the bees very unusually refuse altogether. The Latin name Ruta graevolens means strong-smelling rue, and the herb has been kept in apothecary cupboards from Greece to Galicia for at least 3,000 years. In the apothecary, rue was kept on the upper shelf and dispensed by the careful spoonful. The dried herb was used in small doses for the slow, dull headaches that follow long worry, for the unease of the nervous system that comes upon those grown too thin from fasting, and as a wash for the eyes of those troubled by long reading by candlelight. A weak vinegar of rue, kept in small glass bottles, was used to dab on the temples in plague seasons, for the herb was said to keep the bad airs from settling upon the body. As with many of the herbs on the upper shelf, rue was respected and never given to a woman with child. Let us turn now to the 37th. The 37th is centaury. It is a slender, modest annual of the dry, sunny banks and the chalk meadow, with neat, narrow, opposite leaves and small, deep pink, star-like flowers in the late summer. The plant rarely grows higher than a handspan. The Greek name kentoraion comes from the centaur Chiron, the wise teacher of Asclepius, who according to legend used the herb to heal a wound in his own foot. From that old myth came the herb's long, calm reputation as a bitter tonic. In the apothecary, dried centaury was kept in linen on the middle shelf and used freely as a gentle bitter. A simple infusion of the dried tops in hot water was given as a tonic for those whose appetite had failed after a long fever, for the sluggish digestion of one who had spent too long indoors in the dark months, and for the small repeating headaches that come with the end of a hard winter. The medieval herbalists of the school of Salerno included centaury in their long-keeping cordials of autumn, and the country apothecaries of the late medieval Rhineland kept dried bunches of it on a south-facing shelf to be ready for the spring tonics. In the small English country towns of the Cotswolds, the women of the household made a weak centaury beer each year at Easter, drunk in small cups for the lifting of winter heaviness. Let us turn now to the 38th. The 38th is gentian. It is a tall, sturdy perennial of the alpine meadow, sending up a single stout stem to the height of the knee, with broad ribbed leaves and tall spires of large, deep golden yellow flowers that nod a little in the cool mountain wind. From the deep yellow root came one of the strongest and most useful bitter tonics of the whole European cupboard. In the apothecary, dried gentian root was kept in linen and parted with by the careful inch. A slow cold infusion of the chopped root was given as a tonic to those weakened by long fever, to those whose appetite had failed in the late stages of a hard illness, and to the elderly who could no longer take their food with pleasure. A small spoonful of the bitter cold tea sipped before a meal was reckoned to wake the slow stomach and call back a little of the body's old strength. The mountain herbalists of the Alps and the Pyrenees gathered gentian root in the second autumn after flowering, and dried the long roots in airy attics through the early winter. The Benedictine brothers of St. Bernard's Hospice, in the high pass between Italy and Switzerland, kept gentian schnapps in small flasks for travellers brought in cold and faint from a long crossing, and the warming cup is said to have brought many a foot traveller back to himself. Let us turn now to the 39th. The 39th is yellow dock. It is a tall, sturdy perennial of the damp meadow corner, with long pointed leaves of a cool dark green and tall spikes of small green-brown flowers that turn a deep rust color when the seeds set in late summer. The deep branched golden yellow taproot lifted in the autumn is the strength of the herb and gives it the country name. The Latin name rumex has been with the plant since the days of Pliny. In the apothecary, dried yellow dock root was kept in linen on the middle shelf and treated as a quiet, slow cleanser of the body. A simple decoction of the chopped root in cool water, slowly warmed, was given as a spring tonic to those whose skin had broken into small, troublesome rashes, to those whose digestion had grown sluggish in the dark months, and to women whose monthly courses had become weak with poor diet. A poultice of fresh leaves was laid on a sting from the nettle with which the dock so often grows side by side, that the country children could find their relief without leaving the spot of their trouble. There is a sense in which yellow dock, more than any other herb of the cupboard, belongs to the slow, patient kitchen wisdom of country mothers. Let us turn now to the 40th. The 40th is dandelion. It is the small, bright, irrepressible perennial of the lawn and the roadside, with deeply toothed leaves in a low rosette, and the bright golden flower heads that all the world knows. The French call it pissenlit, for the herb has been a kindly diuretic in the kitchen apothecary for at least 8 centuries. The Latin taraxacum comes through Persian and Arabic from a much older root, meaning bitter herb. Every part of the plant is useful: the leaves, the flowers, and the long brown taproot, dug in autumn. In the apothecary, dandelion was kept in 2 forms. The dried young leaves were stored in linen for the spring tonics, and the dried, slowly roasted root was stored in glass on the middle shelf for the long winter decoctions. A simple infusion of the leaves was given as a kidney-clearing tea to the slow-bodied, the sluggish, and those troubled by small swellings of the lower legs. A decoction of the roasted root was given for the dull liver and the failing appetite of the elderly. A poultice of the fresh leaves was laid upon a slow, healing wound in country fashion. The Norman convents of the high Middle Ages, set among the wet apple orchards of northern France, kept long beds of dandelion along the kitchen path, and the elderly nuns drank a small cup of the warm root decoction every morning of winter, against the heaviness of the body in the dark months. There is something quite tender in a herb so common, so trodden on, so dismissed by the great manor gardeners, and yet so faithfully kind to those who knew how to look at it. Let us turn now to the 41st. The 41st is burdock. It is a great broad-leafed biennial of the waste corner and the abandoned hedge, with enormous heart-shaped leaves the size of a small platter and tight, prickly, purple-flowered burrs in the second summer that fasten themselves to anything passing by. The deep, fleshy taproot, lifted in the autumn of the first year, is one of the steady cleansing roots of the cupboard and has been kept in apothecary stores from the British Isles to Japan for at least 1,000 years. The Japanese name, gobo, gives a hint of how widely the plant has been treasured. In the apothecary, dried burdock root was kept in linen on the middle shelf and used as a slow cleanser. A simple decoction of the chopped root in cool water, slowly warmed for an hour, was given for the skin troubled by small repeating boils and rashes, for the slow stiffness of the joints in the elderly, and for the lingering dullness that follows a hard fever. A poultice of fresh leaves was laid upon a tired knee. The medieval country wives of the English borderlands carried small bags of dried burdock root in their winter linen chests, and the herb was said to be the special medicine of the ploughman and the stonemason, those whose bodies grew rough with the work of the seasons. The cottage tradition treats it with a simple, quiet trust. Let us turn now to the 42nd. The 42nd is cleavers. It is a slender, sticky, scrambling annual of spring hedgerow, with whorls of narrow leaves clinging together along its trailing stems, and small white star-like flowers in late spring. The whole plant clings gently to the cuff of a passing coat or the wrist of a child by means of fine hooked hairs, and from this old habit comes its country name, goosegrass, for the geese of the village pond loved to nibble the soft new shoots in spring. In the apothecary, fresh cleavers were preferred to dried, for the herb is at its best when newly gathered. A simple, cool infusion of the chopped fresh herb in cold water, left to stand from morning until evening, was given as a spring drink for those whose bodies had grown sluggish in the long winter, and for the slow lymphatic swellings that trouble many people in the changing of the seasons. A poultice of the fresh herb was laid on a small, slow-healing wound. The Welsh shepherds on the high pastures of spring drank a cool cleaver's tea in the long mornings of lambing, for the herb was reckoned to keep the body steady through long hours of cold work. It is one of the plainest and most kindly of the cottage herbs. Let us turn now to the 43rd. The 43rd is nettle. It is the tall, dark green, sharply leafed perennial of the rich, damp ground, with toothed, pointed leaves and small green flower clusters in the late spring. The Romans planted nettles wherever they camped, partly for the food and partly for the medicine, and where the legions had gone, a thick stand of nettles often remained 2,000 years later beside a forgotten well. In the apothecary, dried nettle leaves were kept in linen on the lower shelves and used widely. A simple infusion of the dried leaves was given as a building tonic to the pale and the weak, for the leaves were thought to put strength back into thin blood. A spring soup of fresh young nettle tops with barley and a little salted bacon was the kindly Lenten dish of the northern villages, and brought many a household through the long, hungry weeks before the new harvest. The Saxon herbalists called it stide, the upright one, and listed it in the great 9-herb charm against the slow ailments. It is one of those quiet plants whose sting reminds us that the kindest herbs are not always the softest ones to hold. Let us turn now to the 44th.
The 44th is plantain.
It is a low, neat, tough perennial of the trodden path and the cottage doorway, with broad, ribbed, oval leaves in a flat rosette and tall, slender spikes of small green-brown flowers in summer. The Greek name comes from the broad leaf, and the English country name waybread comes from the herb's old deep association with the long road. Wherever a foot has gone, plantain seeds have traveled with it, and the plant is now found in every corner of the temperate world. In the apothecary, fresh plantain leaves were always preferred when they could be found, but dried leaves were kept in linen on the lower shelves for the colder months. The herb was the foot traveller's first balm, a fresh leaf crushed gently between the fingers and laid upon a bee sting, a nettle rash, or a small cut from a thorn, was the cottage child's first lesson in the healing of the hedge. A simple infusion of the leaves was given for the slight bleeding of the gums, and a thicker decoction was used as a wash for slow healing wounds. Pilgrims walking from northern England to the shrine of St. James in Galicia kept a small linen pouch of dried plantain leaves at the bottom of their packs against the blistered feet of the road. There is something very faithful in a plant that, after thousands of years of being trodden on, still returns each year to comfort the foot that has trodden it. Let us turn now to the 45th. The 45th is yarrow. It is a slender, soft-leafed perennial of the dry meadow and the field edge, with finely cut, almost feathery, dark green leaves and flat-topped clusters of small white or pale pink flowers in the high summer. The Latin name Achillea millefolium means the thousand-leaved Achilles plant, for in the old Greek story it was Achilles who, taught by the centaur Chiron, packed crushed yarrow into the wounds of his soldiers at the long siege of Troy. From that legend came the herb's old name, Herba militaris, the soldier's herb. In the apothecary, dried yarrow was kept in linen and used widely. A poultice of the crushed fresh herb was laid upon a wound to staunch the bleeding and to draw the cut closed. A simple infusion of the dried leaves and flowers was given for the small fevers of the changing season, for the cold settling on the chest, and for the slow head of one returning weary from the road. A washing of the body with warm yarrow water was used for the slow healing skin of the elderly. It is a herb of long, faithful service. Let us turn now to the 46th. The 46th is comfrey. It is a tall, broad-leafed perennial of the damp ditch and the cool stream bank, with rough, hairy, oblong leaves and drooping clusters of small bell-shaped pink or pale purple flowers in the late spring. The Latin name, symphytum, comes from a Greek word meaning to grow together, for the herb's old reputation lay in its quiet help to the slow knitting of broken bones beneath their bandages. In the apothecary, comfrey was kept in two forms. The dried leaves were stored in linen for the kitchen poultices, and the dried sliced root was kept in glass on the middle shelf for the slow decoctions. A poultice of fresh crushed root, laid with a clean linen bandage over a slow healing bruise or a small set fracture, was the bone setter's first reach. A simple infusion of the dried leaves was given for the slow recovery of those bedridden by long illness. The medieval English bone setters of the country towns, often local women of long, quiet experience, kept thick beds of comfrey at the corners of their kitchen gardens. There is a soft tradition recorded in the late Welsh herbal of the physicians of Maedvi that a tea of comfrey root given to a household in mourning would help to mend the small invisible breaks in the body that follow a hard winter loss. Let us turn now to the 47th. The 47th is self-heal. It is a small, low-growing perennial of the damp meadow and the shady lawn, with neat oval leaves in opposite pairs and short, blunt clusters of small purple-blue flowers in the high summer. The English country name describes the plant exactly. From at least the early Middle Ages, self-heal has been the cottage herb of the small wound, the bitten tongue, the sore mouth that follows a long damp day. The Latin name Prunella vulgaris has the herb spread quietly across most of the temperate world in lawns where it has often never been planted at all. In the apothecary, dried self-heal was kept in linen on the lower shelves. A simple gargle was made by infusing the dried herb in hot water with a little salt, and the warm cup was used for sore throats, for the small ulcers within the cheek that follow a winter of poor bread, and for the bleeding of the gum. A poultice of the fresh leaves laid on a small wound in the field would staunch the slight bleeding and hold the edges of the cut closed. There is, in the cool meadow grasses of any old churchyard, a small dark purple flower nodding by the stones that has been quietly minding the small hurts of small people for an extremely long time. Let us turn now to the 48th. The 48th is St. John's wort. It is a slender, woody-stemmed perennial of the dry, sunny bank and the open hillside, with neat oval leaves whose backs are studded with tiny translucent dots, and bright golden five-petaled flowers that open in the high warmth of midsummer. The Latin name, Hypericum perforatum, refers to those small dots which look on close inspection as if a fine needle had been pushed through the leaf. In the medieval cupboard, the plant was much loved and gathered in great bunches on the morning of the 24th of June, the eve of St. John, from which it took its English name. In the apothecary, the fresh flowering tops were steeped in olive oil in a clean glass jar, set upon a sunny windowsill, and turned each day for 2 or 3 weeks until the oil ran a deep ruby red. This St. John's wort oil was kept on the middle shelf and used widely as a salve for the slow wounds of the hand, for the burns of the kitchen, and for the bruises of the field. A simple infusion of the dried herb was given for the long melancholy of the dark months, and for the unease that comes after a fright. In the late medieval villages of the Black Forest, the country folk hung small bunches of St. John's wort above the doorways at midsummer to keep the bad airs from settling on the household. The herb was called Fuga Daemonum, the flight of demons, and the careful Cistercian brothers of southern Germany included the dried tops in their lifting cordials for the brothers grown weary in the long penitential weeks of winter. It is a herb of light, quietly held in glass against the dark. Let us turn now to the 49th. The 49th is calendula. It is a sturdy, bright-flowered annual of the cottage kitchen garden, with sticky, slightly hairy, light green leaves and the warm orange-yellow daisy-like flowers that close at night and open with the first morning sun. The English country name pot marigold refers to the warm yellow soup the country wives made by adding a few of the bright petals to a thin winter broth. In the apothecary, fresh calendula petals were preferred when they could be had, and dried petals were kept in linen for the colder months. The fresh flowering tops were steeped in olive oil for several weeks on a sunny shelf until the oil ran a deep gold color, and from this came the kindly calendula salve used for kitchen burns, for the small scrapes of children, and for the slow sore skin of the elderly. A simple infusion of the petals was given for sluggish digestion and for the small fevers of spring. The herbalist sisters of the Tuscan convents made small wax tablets of calendula salve for the poor pilgrims who came in foot blistered from the long road to Assisi, and the records of the Abbey of St. Galganus in the late 13th century list 2 pots of calendula oil among the regular winter purchases of the infirmary. It is, like St. John's wort, a herb of held light, very kindly to the surface of the body. Let us turn now to the 50th. The 50th is arnica. It is a sturdy, low, hairy perennial of the high mountain meadow, with broad oval leaves in a flat rosette and tall, single-stemmed, bright yellow daisy-like flowers in the high summer. The plant has rarely been moved out of its native cool mountain pastures and gathers its strength from the thin air and the bright, slow sun of the high places. The Greek name may come from arnakis, lambskin, for the soft-haired leaf has the texture of a lamb's ear pressed between the fingers. In the apothecary of the alpine country, dried arnica flowers were kept in linen and parted with carefully. A salve of the fresh flowers, simmered in lard or sweet butter and strained through fine linen, was used externally upon bruises, sprains, and the small, slow-healing knocks of mountain travel. The salve was famous in the high pastures of the Tyrol and the Bavarian Alps as the falling-down herb, for the shepherds carried small pots of it in their leather satchels against the inevitable knocks of long days on steep ground. The Tyrolean and Swiss village apothecaries kept arnica salve in stoneware, sealed with wax, for the long summer trekking parties, and the records of one small Bavarian apothecary in the late 17th century list the salve as the most regularly demanded preparation of summer months. The herb was, by long tradition, used only on the outside of the body, never in. Let us turn now to the 51st.
The 51st is witch hazel.
It is a small, gnarled, deciduous shrub of the cool eastern North American woodlands, with broad, oval, slightly toothed leaves and unusual small spidery flowers that open in late autumn after the leaves have fallen. The bark and the small forked twigs are the strength of the herb and have been used by the indigenous peoples of those forests, the Mohegan, the Cherokee, the Iroquois, for many generations, before the first European herbals were written. The early colonial herbalists, learning slowly from their indigenous neighbors, brought the plant into the Atlantic apothecary cupboards in the 17th century. In the colonial apothecary that grew up in the wake of the medieval tradition, the small forked twigs were stripped of their bark in the autumn, dried in airy lofts, and stored in linen on the lower shelves. A simple decoction of the bark was prepared in cool water, slowly warmed for an hour, and strained into clean glass bottles. A small piece of clean linen, dipped in the cool decoction and laid upon a bruise, was the steady standard of the herb's use. A weaker preparation was used as a wash for the slow-healing skin of the elderly. The herb arrived late in the long European cupboard, but was welcomed easily, for it sat in the same kindly tradition as yarrow and calendula. Let us turn now to the 52nd. The 52nd is Solomon's seal. It is a graceful, arching perennial of the cool, deciduous woodland, with paired oval leaves on long-boughed stems and small, drooping pairs of greenish-white tubular flowers in the late spring. The horizontal underground rhizome, when broken, shows on its cut surface a pattern of small round scars where the previous year's stems have stood, and these little circular marks were said in the old country tradition to look like the seal of King Solomon. From this ancient resemblance came the herb's quiet biblical name. In the Apothecary, the dried, sliced rhizome was kept in linen on the middle shelf. A poultice of the fresh, crushed root, laid with a clean linen bandage over a bruised joint, a sprained ankle, or a slow-healing knock from field work, was the steady standard of its use. A weaker decoction of the dried root was given internally for the slow recovery of those weakened by long fevers, but only by an experienced hand, for the herb was respected. The records of the Abbey Infirmary at Tintern, in the cool valleys of the Wye, mention a small bed of Solomon's seal kept along the north wall of the cloister garden, for the slow healing knocks of the old monks at the long task of the daily psalms. There is something gentle in a herb whose stems bow naturally toward the ground, as if remembering the quiet patience of those who used it. Let us turn now to the 53rd. The 53rd is horsetail. It is a slender, hollow-stemmed, ancient perennial of the damp ditch and the wet clay bank, with pale silver-grey, jointed, leafless stems that ring softly when broken between the fingers. The plant has been on the earth for far longer than any of us, having walked through the long Carboniferous forests when our ancestors were not yet imagined. The Latin name equisetum means horse's tail, for the rings of fine green branchlets along the upper stem look very like the bristles of a soft horsehair brush. In the Apothecary, the dried summer stems were kept in linen on the lower shelves and used in a number of plain, quiet ways. A simple infusion of the dried herb was given as a kidney-clearing tea for the slow swellings of the legs and for the slight discomfort of those troubled by the small early stones of the bladder. A poultice of the fresh herb, gently warmed, was laid on a slow-healing wound. The dried stems, full of fine silica, were also folded into small linen pads and used by the cottage cobblers to polish the sole leather of their best work, for the herb is full of a fine natural grit that brings up a warm shine on horn and metal. The herb appears in many Anglo-Saxon and Norman household lists as a quiet companion of winter, faithful as a candle. Let us turn now to the 54th. The 54th is shepherd's purse. It is a slender, slightly weedy biennial of the field edge and the cottage wall, with small, neat, deeply toothed lower leaves in a flat rosette, a slim flowering stem, and tiny white four-petaled flowers that ripen quickly into small heart-shaped, purse-like seed pods. From those small seed cases, looking very like the cinched leather money bags hung at the belts of medieval shepherds, the plant takes its kindly old country name. In the Apothecary, dried shepherd's purse was kept in linen on the lower shelves, and the herb had a particular and respected place in the apothecary's care of women. A simple infusion of the dried herb was given to staunch the slow bleeding of an overlong cycle, to ease the heavy first hours after a hard childbirth, and to settle the small repeated nosebleeds that sometimes trouble children and the elderly in dry weather. A weaker preparation was used as a wash for the slow-healing skin of the convalescent. The herb has been called by old country usage the midwife's quiet helper, for the small simple infusion has steadied many a long and difficult night beside the cradle. Let us turn now to the 55th. The 55th is Lady's Mantle. It is a soft, low-growing perennial of the cool meadow and the cottage edge, with broad, scalloped, deeply pleated leaves of a quiet grey-green and small clusters of tiny green-yellow flowers in the high summer. The leaf has a beautiful particular habit of holding small round drops of dew at its very center each morning, sparkling like tiny crystal beads in the early sun. From those bright drops, which the medieval alchemists believed to be the purest water in the world, the herb has its old Latin name, alchemilla, the little alchemist's herb. In the apothecary, dried lady's mantle was kept in linen on the lower shelves, and was used most particularly in the apothecary's care of women. A simple infusion of the dried herb was given to ease the small troubles of the menstrual cycle, to steady the body in the long years near the change of life, and to calm the nervous unease that follows a difficult childbirth. A wash of the warm tea was used for slow healing skin and for the gentle care of an older complexion. There is a quiet kindness in the way this herb has been a steady companion to so many women, in so many small unrecorded rooms for so many quiet centuries. Let us turn now to the 56th. The 56th is motherwort. It is a tall, sturdy perennial of the damp meadow corner and the cottage wall, with deeply lobed, sharply pointed leaves and small whorls of pale pink-purple flowers in the high summer. The English country name describes the herb's old place at the fireside of the medieval mother. In the apothecary, dried motherwort was kept in linen and used carefully. A simple infusion of the dried tops in hot water, sweetened a little with honey to soften the bitterness, was given for the heart fluttering of those grown anxious in the long sleepless nights of new motherhood, for the unease of women in the long years near the change of life, and for the small palpitations of those overworked at the long task of caring for an extended household. The herb was reckoned to steady the heart without dulling the mind, and to give back a small return of patience to a body run too thin. The Italian herbalists of the school of Salerno included motherwort in their long-keeping cordials for the women of the ducal households, and the German country wives kept dried motherwort in small linen bags inside their kitchen cupboards, replaced each year at harvest. The herb, like a few of its quiet companions, is medicine for the long patience of women. Let us turn now to the 57th. The 57th is raspberry leaf. It is the long, arching, prickly cane of the wild raspberry of the damp woodland edge, and the old cottage hedgerow, with three-fingered green leaves whose backs are silvery pale, and small white five-petaled flowers in the early summer that ripen into the soft scarlet fruits of summer table. The leaves gathered before the fruits ripen have been one of the most quiet and faithful of the medieval women's herbs, kept in apothecary cupboards from England to the Carpathians for at least 800 years. In the apothecary, dried raspberry leaves were stored on the lower shelves and treated as a gentle, kindly tonic. A simple infusion of the dried leaves in hot water, sweetened a little with honey, was the standard preparation. The midwives of the rural villages gave the warm cup to expectant mothers in the last weeks before a birth, on the country wisdom that the herb steadied the body and prepared the womb for an easier hour of labor. A slightly stronger infusion was used as a gargle for the small sore mouth and a wash for the slow healing skin of the elderly. The English country midwives of the late medieval period spoke of the herb as the Friday tea, for it was given by tradition on Fridays to the women in waiting, that the body might be ready for the work of the coming week. There is a great deal of medieval medicine that has been lost in the great printed books, but a great deal of it has been kept alive in the small handwritten recipe books of country mothers, and the raspberry leaf has been one of its most faithful companions. Let us turn now to the 58th. The 58th is black cohosh. It is a tall, graceful perennial of the cool eastern North American woodlands, with broad, divided leaves and tall, slender spires of small, white, feathery flowers in the high summer. The deep, dark, slightly knotted underground rhizome lifted in the autumn is the strength of the herb and gives it its quiet, unhurried country name. The plant was a long-trusted medicine of the indigenous peoples of those forests, the Lenape, the Algonquin, the Haudenosaunee, before the first colonial herbals were written. In the colonial apothecary that inherited the medieval cupboard, dried black cohosh root was kept in linen on the middle shelf. A simple cold infusion of the chopped root in cool water, left to stand from morning until evening, was given for the slow troubles of the menstrual cycle, for the unease of women in the long years near the change of life, and for the slow stiffness of the joints in the elderly. A weaker preparation was used as a wash for the slow healing skin of the convalescent. The 17th century colonial midwives of New England, learning carefully from the Mohawk and Oneida women of the upper Hudson Valley, came to keep small linen bags of dried black cohosh root in their birthing baskets, and the herb passed gradually into the long English-speaking women's tradition of the eastern seaboard. The herb, like the passion flower before it, was welcomed for its kindness. Let us turn now to the 59th. The 59th is blue cohosh. It is a slender perennial of the same cool deciduous woodlands, with neat, divided blue-green leaves and small clusters of yellowish flowers in the late spring, ripening into bright dark blueberries on red stems by the autumn. The blue stems and the bright berries are the herb's particular signature, and any woodland walker who has come upon a small stand of blue cohosh in the late summer remembers the strange clean blue of it. The plant was a long-respected medicine of the Lenape, the Mohawk, and the Mohican women of the cool northern forests. In the colonial apothecary, dried blue cohosh root was kept in linen on the middle shelf beside the black cohosh and used by the careful pinch. A simple cold infusion of the chopped root was used by the experienced midwife in the last hours of a slow labor to steady the body and to encourage a difficult birth that had grown over long. The herb was respected and never used without the careful eye of an experienced hand. A weaker preparation was used for the small troubles of an irregular cycle. The Mohican midwives of the upper Hudson Valley used blue cohosh root in their birthing huts on the small clearings beside the long woodland streams, and the colonial midwives of the Albany Valley learned the herb from them in the 17th century. The herb belongs to the close and long generations of midwifery. Let us turn now to the 60th. The 60th is pulsatilla. It is a small, soft-furred perennial of the chalky meadows and the dry hillsides of Central Europe, with finely cut feathery leaves and the delicate, drooping bellflowers of pale violet that open in the cool weeks of early spring. The flowers nod a little in the wind, and the long silken seed heads that follow them in the high summer drift slowly across the meadow when the breeze takes them. From the slow flutter of the bloom in the early wind comes the herb's old country name, the windflower. In the apothecary, pulsatilla was kept on a higher shelf and parted with carefully. The dried herb was used in very small doses by an experienced hand for the soft, slow troubles of the spirit that sometimes settled upon those grown weary in the long care of others. A weak infusion was given to those who had been long beside a sick bed, to those who had lost a loved one in a slow illness, and to women whose hearts had grown heavy in the long years near the change of life. The herb was reckoned to soften the small-held griefs that lay beneath the surface of a tired life. The medieval German apothecaries of the Black Forest villages kept dried pulsatilla in small dark glass vials on the south-facing shelf of the cupboard, where the weak winter light might keep the herb dry without losing its strength. The Cistercian sisters of southern Bavaria included pulsatilla, in very small amounts, in the slow lifting cordials of the Lenten weeks. There is a quietness in this herb that has belonged very specifically to those whose lives have grown small around the slow needs of others. Let us turn now to the 61st. The 61st is mullein. It is a tall, stately biennial of the dry hillside and the abandoned field, with great, soft, woolly, silver-grey leaves arranged in a flat rosette in the first year, and a single tall flowering stem rising in the second year, sometimes to the height of a grown man, hung with small, bright yellow five-petaled flowers along its length. The dried flowering stalk was sometimes dipped in tallow and lit as a slow torch by the medieval country folk, and from this old custom the herb takes one of its very oldest country names, the torch flower. In the apothecary, dried mullein leaves and flowers were kept in linen on the lower shelves and used widely for the chest. A simple infusion of the dried flowers in hot water, sweetened with honey, was given for the persistent dry cough of winter, for the breath that came short on the high pasture, and for the slow chest of the elderly. A poultice of the warmed leaves was laid on the chest of those troubled by the long, deep cough. The Scottish Highland shepherds kept small dried bunches of mullein in the rafters of their lonely high pasture huts, and the great soft leaves were folded into the boots of the slow walker against the cold of the heather paths. There is a great quiet dignity in this herb, and a long faithful kindness toward the breath. Let us turn now to the 62nd. The 62nd is coltsfoot. It is a small, low-growing perennial of the damp clay bank and the broken roadside, with bright, golden, daisy-like flowers that open very early in the spring, often before the snow has gone, and broad, hoof-shaped, slightly downy leaves that come up only after the flowers have faded. The Latin name, tussilago, means the cougher's herb, and the old Roman name for the plant says, in a single word, almost everything we need to know about it. In the apothecary, dried coltsfoot leaves and dried flowers were kept in linen on the lower shelves and used widely for the chest. A simple infusion of the dried herb in hot water, sweetened with honey, was the cottage standard for the persistent long winter cough, for the breath that came short on a cold morning, and for the slow chest of children grown weak with a damp winter. A small handful of the dried leaves, mixed with mullein, was sometimes slowly smouldered upon a low, warm coal, and the rising soft smoke was breathed in carefully for a tired bronchial cough. The medieval Latin country name for the plant, Filius antipatrum, the son before the father, refers to the way the flowers come up before the leaves, as if the child of the plant arrived in the world before its own parent. The herb has been a kindly companion of the breath for a very long time. Let us turn now to the 63rd. The 63rd is horehound. It is a low, woolly, grey-leafed perennial of the dry, stony bank and the chalky cottage corner, with crinkled, slightly furred leaves and small haws of pale white flowers in the high summer. The whole plant carries a clean, dry, slightly bitter, slightly resinous scent that is unmistakable to the hand of any old country herbalist. The Hebrew name for the herb is said to be related to the word for bitter, and the plant has been used in apothecary cupboards from the Levant through the Mediterranean to the cool kitchens of the European north for at least 3,000 years. In the apothecary, dried horehound leaves and flowering tops were kept in linen on the middle shelf. A simple infusion of the dried herb in hot water, sweetened generously with honey to soften the strong bitterness, was given for the persistent dry winter cough, for the chest grown heavy with a slow cold, and for the small repeating tightness of the breath that troubled the elderly in the damp hours before dawn. A slow syrup of horehound and honey, simmered over a low fire and kept in stoneware, was given by the spoonful through the long winter. The country wives of the late medieval English Cotswolds kept jars of horehound candy on a high shelf. The slow-boiled syrup poured out onto a buttered slate to set in small dark twists. There is in the deep, simple bitterness of horehound and the warm sweetness of the honey that softens it, a small picture of all medieval pharmacy. Let us turn now to the 64th. The 64th is mallow. It is a sturdy, cheerful biennial of the cottage wall and the warm garden corner, with broad, heart-shaped, slightly toothed leaves and small pink-purple flowers along the trailing stems through the high summer. The whole plant, leaves, flowers and roots, carries a soft, slightly slimy mucilage when crushed between the fingers, and that gentle slipperiness is the strength of the herb. The Romans called it malva, and the Charlemagne capitulary of the 8th century, which lists the 73 plants every imperial garden ought to contain, places mallow near the head of the list. In the apothecary, dried mallow leaves and flowers were kept in linen on the lower shelves and used freely. A simple cold infusion of the dried herb, left to stand from morning until evening, gave a soft, cool, slightly slippery drink that was given for the small dry cough of late winter, for the sore mouth of one whose teeth had grown loose, and for the small, slow troubles of the digestion that come with too long a life on coarse bread. A poultice of the warmed leaves was laid on a small, slow-healing burn or a bee sting. The Roman gourmet Apicius gives recipes for mallow in soup, the broad young leaves cooked tender in a thin meat broth. The Byzantine apothecaries of Constantinople prepared a sweet conserve of mallow flowers and honey for the convalescent of the great hospitals of the city. The medieval English country wives kept young mallow plants beside the kitchen door, and a leaf was often slipped into the warm broth set before a child kept long abed by a slow fever. The herb is one of the gentlest in the cupboard. Let us turn now to the 65th. The 65th is marshmallow. It is the great, stately marshland cousin of the cottage mallow, a tall, sturdy perennial of the damp ditch and the salt marsh edge, with broad, soft, slightly furred grey-green leaves and small pale pink five-petalled flowers along the upper stem in the late summer. The deep, fleshy white root lifted in the autumn is the strength, and the long Greek name, Althea, means the healing herb. The Roman writers spoke of it warmly, and the medieval apothecaries kept the dried root on the middle shelf in clean linen. In the apothecary, the dried, sliced root was prepared in two main ways. A slow cold infusion of the chopped root in cool water, left to stand from morning until evening, gave a soft, sweet, slippery drink that was given for the dry, sore throat of winter, for the small, dry cough of the elderly, and for the slow troubles of the stomach. A thicker decoction of the root, slowly simmered, was used as a wash for slow-healing burns and as a soft poultice for the slow, sore skin of the bedridden. There is in the marshmallow root a deep softness that has comforted small bodies for 1,000 years. Let us turn now to the 66th. The 66th is Elecampane. It is a tall, sturdy perennial of the damp meadow and the cottage edge, with broad, rough, slightly woolly leaves and large, bright yellow daisy-like flowers in the high summer that nod a little above the leafy stems. The deep, fleshy, slightly aromatic root, lifted in the autumn of the second year, is the strength of the herb. The Greek name, inula, was used by Pliny the Elder, who said it gladdened the heart. The English country name comes through Old French and Old Latin from Silenium, the herb of Helen, for an old Mediterranean myth said the plant first sprang from the tears Helen of Troy let fall as she was carried away to Troy. In the apothecary, dried elecampane root was kept in linen on the middle shelf and used widely for the chest. A simple decoction of the chopped root in cool water, slowly warmed for an hour and sweetened with honey, was given for the persistent deep winter cough, for the slow chest of one weakened by long fever, and for the breath that came short on the damp morning. A slow syrup of elecampane and honey, kept in stoneware through the long winter, was given by the spoonful to children with the slow chest of the cold months. The medieval Saxon herbalists called the plant horse-heel for the dried root, was given to weary horses at the close of the ploughing days as a quiet help to the breath. The herb has been a faithful companion to the chest of the working body for at least 2,000 years. Let us turn now to the 67th. The 67th is licorice. It is a sturdy, deep-rooted perennial of the dry valley and the riverside thicket of the eastern Mediterranean and Central Asia, with neat, divided pinnate leaves and small spikes of pale violet pea-like flowers in the high summer. The long, deep, golden-brown taproot, lifted in the autumn of the second year, is the strength of the herb and gives it the soft, sweet flavor that has been treasured in apothecary cupboards from the pharaonic court of Egypt to the small herb shops of medieval Bristol. The Greek name, glycyrrhiza, means simply sweet root. In the apothecary, dried licorice root was kept in linen on the middle shelf and used very widely. A simple decoction of the sliced root in cool water, slowly warmed for an hour, gave a soft, sweet drink that was given for the dry, sore throat of winter, for the slow chest of the elderly, and for the small disquiet of the stomach. The dried root was also chewed slowly, like a small wooden toothbrush, and the country children of medieval England kept small lengths of licorice stick in their winter pockets as a slow, gentle sweetness for the long road home from school. The Greek philosopher Theophrastus, writing in the 3rd century before Christ, mentions licorice as the Scythian root and notes that the horseman of the Black Sea steppe kept a small piece in the cheek to ease thirst on the long open ride. The Egyptian apothecaries had used the root for at least 1,000 years before him. The herb is one of the great quiet treasures of the cupboard. Let us turn now to the 68th. The 68th is garlic. It is the small, tough, persistent member of the lily family of the dry hillside, with narrow, flat green leaves and a tall, slender flowering stem topped with a tight, round head of small, white star flowers in the high summer. The white papery bulb, lifted in the late summer and dried in airy lofts, is the strength of the herb and has been kept in apothecary cupboards from the pyramid builders of Old Kingdom Egypt to the village kitchens of late medieval Saxony for at least 4,000 years. In the apothecary, dried garlic was kept in plaited strings hanging from the rafters and used very widely. A simple decoction of crushed cloves in warm water, sweetened a little with honey to soften the bite, was given for the persistent winter cough, for the chest grown heavy with a slow cold, and as a quiet protection in the seasons when the great pestilence walked through the towns. A poultice of crushed cloves, beaten with a little lard, was laid on a slow healing wound. A spoonful of garlic vinegar was kept in many of the household cordials of winter. The Roman legionaries planted garlic in the gardens of every camp from Hadrian's Wall to the Black Sea. The medieval Italian apothecaries of Bologna and Padua kept long-plated strings of garlic in the upper rooms of the pharmacy, and the country wives of late medieval France hung small bunches of dried garlic over the doors of their houses in plague seasons. The herb has been a faithful companion in many long centuries. Let us turn now to the 69th. The 69th is onion. It is the tall, hollow-stemmed cousin of the garlic, a sturdy biennial of the cottage garden bed, with hollow blue-green leaves and a tall flowering stem topped by a great round head of small pale pink starflowers in the second summer. The fat papery bulb, lifted in the late summer and dried slowly in airy lofts, is the strength of the herb. The Roman writers gave the plant its long Latin name Oleum saper, and the country folk of every European nation have kept it in their kitchens in roughly the same way for at least 3,000 years. In the apothecary, dried onions were kept in plaited strings hanging from the rafters and used very widely. A simple syrup of onion juice and honey, simmered over a low fire and kept in stoneware, was given by the spoonful for the persistent winter cough, for the chest grown heavy with a slow cold, and for the slow breath of the elderly. A poultice of the warm-cooked onion, wrapped in clean linen, was laid on the chest in deep coughs and on the cheek for an aching tooth. A slice of fresh onion was sometimes laid on the soles of the feet of one in fever, on the old country wisdom that the warmth of the body would be drawn down through the herb. The Roman physician Galen wrote of onion as the blood-quickening herb, and the medieval Italian apothecaries of Salerno included onion juice in their long winter cordials. The herb is one of the great steady kitchen medicines of the cupboard. Let us turn now to the 70th.
The 70th is the leek.
It is the tall, blue-green, mild-flavoured cousin of the onion, a sturdy biennial of the cottage garden bed, with broad, flat, blue-green leaves arranged in a tight, upright sheath, and the long, white, blanched stem at the base that is the strength. The Romans called the plant Allium porum, and the broad, mild stem has been kept in the kitchens of the European north for at least 2,000 years. The herb has a particular, almost devotional place in the long kitchen tradition of Wales, where to this day a small leek is worn at the cap on St. David's Day. In the Apothecary, fresh and dried leeks were kept in the kitchen and used very widely as a soft, gentle, digestive herb. A simple, slow broth of leeks, barley, and a little salted bacon, simmered gently over the low coals through the cool morning, was the country wife's first reach for one returning weak from a long fever. A poultice of warmed leek leaves wrapped in clean linen was laid on the chest of one troubled by a slow cough. A weak decoction of the white stems was given for the heaviness of the stomach. There is something gentle in a herb whose long career has been the patient nourishment of small kitchens. Let us turn now to the 71st. The 71st is mustard. It is the tall, slender, bright, yellow-flowered annual of the cottage garden and the rough field with deeply lobed, bright green leaves and small four-petaled yellow flowers in the late spring, ripening into the small round seeds of a sharp, hot, peppery flavor by the high summer. The Romans called it sinape, and the herb has been kept in apothecary cupboards from Pythagoras's Greek school to the late medieval German monasteries for at least 2,500 years. The mathematician and philosopher Pythagoras, writing in the 6th century before Christ, called mustard the herb of clear thought. In the apothecary, dried mustard seed was kept on the middle shelf and used carefully. The seed was crushed in the mortar with a little warm water just before use, for the strength of the herb fades quickly. A poultice of crushed mustard, mixed with bread crumb and warm water, was laid in clean linen upon the chest of one troubled by a deep, heavy winter cough, and the warm fire of the herb was reckoned to draw the slow heat of the body up to the surface, where it could break and pass out. A weak infusion of the seed was given for the stomach of the elderly. The herb's old tradition of bringing the warmth of the body to the surface, gently and quickly, has been kept in the country apothecary of the European North for 2,000 years and more. Let us turn now to the 72nd. The 72nd is horseradish. It is a tall, sturdy perennial of the damp garden corner, with broad, glossy, dark green leaves and a tall, flowering stem topped with small, four-petaled white flowers in the second summer. The deep, fleshy, knotty white taproot, lifted in the autumn, is the strength of the herb and gives off, when freshly grated, the sharp, eye-watering pungency that anyone who has stood at a winter table beside roast beef remembers. The Latin name, Armoratia rusticana, names the plant the country horseradish, and the herb has been the kitchen medicine of the damp regions of Central and Northern Europe for at least 1,000 years. In the apothecary, freshly grated horseradish was used by preference, for the dried root loses much of its sharp, clean fire. A small spoonful of the grated root, taken in a little vinegar and warm water, was given for the persistent heavy winter cough, for the slow chest of one whose breath came short, and for the dull head of one grown sluggish in the long indoor weeks of late winter. A poultice of the grated root, mixed with a little warm water, was laid in clean linen upon the small of the back for the slow ache of the working ploughman. The German country apothecaries called horseradish the root of bishops, for the herb was so often pressed into use at the long Lenten and Easter tables of the great cathedral chapters. There is a fine, clean fire in this herb that wakes a slow body. Let us turn now to the 73rd. The 73rd is ginger. It is a tall, slender, leafy perennial of the warm, damp lowlands of southern Asia, with broad, shining green leaves arranged along a single upright stem and small clusters of pale yellow-green flowers held close to the ground. The fat, knotty, fleshy underground rhizome, lifted slowly in the autumn, is the strength of the herb, and has been treasured in apothecary cupboards from the markets of Cairo through the spice halls of Venice to the small kitchens of late medieval England for at least 2,000 years. The Greek name zingiber comes through Sanskrit from a much older Asian root. In the apothecary, dried ginger root was kept on the middle shelf, ground in the mortar as needed. A simple decoction of the ground root in hot water, sweetened with honey, was given for the cold belly, for the slow nausea of long travel, and for the cold heaviness of the limbs in the depths of winter. A small candied piece of the root was kept in the pocket of those whose work took them out into the long cold roads of December as a slow warmth. The Roman physician Galen called ginger the warm-up for the cold belly. The medieval Italian apothecaries of Venice imported the dried root in great quantities through the spice trade, and the records of the old apothecary of the Doge's Palace in the late 13th century list ginger among the most carefully purchased herbs of the year. The herb is one of the great steady warmers of the cupboard. Let us turn now to the 74th. The 74th is black pepper. It is the small climbing vine of the wet forests of southern India and Sri Lanka, with neat oval leaves and small spikes of tiny green flowers that ripen into the small round green, then red berries which, dried slowly in the sun, become the small black peppercorns of the kitchen jar. The Latin name Piper nigrum has been with the herb since Roman times. The Roman writers spoke of pepper with a kind of wonder, for the spice was carried by long sea voyage from the southern Malabar coast, and a small bag of peppercorns was, at one point, worth its weight in silver in the markets of the imperial capital. In the apothecary, dried peppercorns were kept on the middle shelf and used very carefully. A small pinch of the freshly crushed pepper was given in a warm broth to one returning weak from a long cold journey, to one whose digestion had grown sluggish in the dark months, and to the elderly whose appetite had failed. A poultice of the warm bruised pepper, mixed with a little crushed cumin and warm water, was laid in clean linen upon the small of the back for the slow ache of winter rider. The Roman gourmet Apicius gives recipes in which pepper is sprinkled on almost everything, including the famous spiced honey cakes of the Saturnalia table. The medieval Italian apothecaries of Genoa and Venice purchased dried pepper in great quantities through the long sea trade, and the great spice routes of the late medieval period are essentially the long story of the European pursuit of this small black berry. The country wives of late medieval England paid in pepper for the rent of their small holdings, and the old country expression, a peppercorn rent, comes from this very custom. Let us turn now to the 75th. The 75th is cinnamon. It is the slender evergreen tree of the wet forests of Sri Lanka, of southern India, and of the Malabar coast, with neat oval leaves and small clusters of pale yellow flowers in the warm season. The thin inner bark of the small new branches, peeled in long strips and dried slowly in the warm shadows, curls into the familiar quill of the kitchen cinnamon. The Phoenician traders of the eastern Mediterranean brought cinnamon by long caravan and long ship to the ports of the ancient world for at least 3,000 years, and the dried curl of bark has scented the great spice halls of the medieval cupboard from Lisbon to Lubeck. In the apothecary, dried cinnamon quills were kept on the middle shelf, ground in the mortar as needed. A simple decoction of the ground bark in warm water or warm wine, sweetened with honey, was given for the slow, cold belly of one returning weak from a long winter journey, for the stomach of the elderly, and for the small disquiet of the stomach that follows a heavy meal. A pinch of the ground spice was sprinkled on warm milk for a child kept long abed by a slow fever. The medieval Italian apothecaries of Venice and Genoa purchased dried cinnamon by long sea voyage through the Levant, and the records of the great apothecary of St. Mark's in the late 13th century list cinnamon as one of the most carefully kept and most carefully used herbs of the cupboard. The Phoenician traders, 2,000 years earlier, are said to have invented elaborate stories of the dangers of obtaining cinnamon, partly in earnest and partly to keep their long trade routes their own. Let us turn now to the 76th. The 76th is cardamom. It is the slender, leafy perennial of the wet forests of the western Ghats of southern India, with broad, bright green leaves arranged along a tall stem and small spikes of pale flowers held close to the ground that ripen, very slowly into the dark seeds of the kitchen spice. The Greek name eleuteria comes through Old Sanskrit from a much older root, and the small green pods have traveled by long caravan and long ship from the spice ports of Calicut to the apothecaries of Damascus, of Alexandria, of Venice, and of London for at least 2,000 years. In the apothecary, dried cardamom pods were kept on the middle shelf and used carefully. A small pinch of the freshly crushed seeds was added to warm milk, to warm wine, or to the long-keeping cordials. The herb was used for the heaviness of the stomach, for the small persistent breath that needed a quiet sweetness, and as a careful ingredient in the long winter electuaries of the apothecary. The Persian apothecaries of medieval Baghdad and Isfahan included cardamom in many of their long-keeping cordials, often with cinnamon and a little crushed clove, and sealed the preparations in small dark glass for winter. The famous physician Avicenna, writing in the 11th century, called cardamom the perfumer's seed. The Arab perfumers of medieval Cairo crushed the small green pods into the long-keeping rose waters of the great mosques, that the air might be sweet for the prayer of the morning. The herb is one of the gentle treasures of the spice trade. Let us turn now to the 77th. The 77th is the clove. It is the small dried flower bud of a slender evergreen tree of the warm Maluku Islands, the small ancient spice islands lying in the deep equatorial seas east of Java. The tree carries small oval leaves and clusters of pale flower buds that, picked just before opening and dried slowly in the warm shadows, become the small, dark, hard, nail-shaped buds of the kitchen jar. The English country name comes from the Latin clavus. The nail for the dried bud has very much the look of a tiny black hand-forged carpenter's nail. The herb has been carried by long ship from the Spice Islands to the apothecaries of the Mediterranean for at least 2,000 years. In the apothecary, dried cloves were kept on the middle shelf and used sparingly. A small pinch of the freshly crushed cloves was added to warm wine for the cold belly, to slow, long-keeping cordials of the cupboard, and to the small, careful electuaries given to those weakened by long fever. A whole clove, slowly chewed, was placed against an aching tooth as one of the most reliable home remedies of the medieval cupboard, for the bud carries a strong natural numbing that gives a slow, simple relief. The medieval Italian apothecaries of Venice purchased dried cloves through the long sea trade with the Maluku Islands, and the records of the small apothecary at the Doge's palace list cloves among the most expensive and most carefully kept of the kitchen spices. The Persian dentists of the medieval period, several centuries before any European tooth puller would think of it, used a small clove against a sore tooth and quietly settled many a long agony. Let us turn now to the 78th. The 78th is nutmeg. It is the small round seed kernel of a slender evergreen tree of the Banda Islands, lying in the deep equatorial seas east of the Maluku Spice Islands. The tree carries small oval leaves and small pale yellow flowers that ripen into a soft yellow apricot-like fruit, and within the soft fruit lies the great glossy seed coat of the tree, the bright crimson aril, and within the aril the small round dark seed kernel that is the kitchen nutmeg. The herb has been carried by long ship from the small Banda Islands to the apothecaries of the Mediterranean since the 9th century, when the Arab traders first opened the long sea route to the Spice Islands. In the apothecary, dried nutmegs were kept whole on the middle shelf, grated as needed. A small pinch of the freshly grated nutmeg was added to warm milk in the long winter evening for one who could not settle to sleep, to warm wine for one returning cold from the road, and to the long-keeping cordials. The herb was reckoned to bring warm, slow dreams to the heavy-headed sleeper, and so was sometimes called the dreaming spice. The English physician Nicholas Culpeper, writing in the 17th century, said that a single grated nutmeg in warm milk at the close of a long working day would coax the body to its bed. Let us turn now to the 79th. The 79th is mace. It is the bright crimson lacy aril that surrounds the dark seed kernel of the nutmeg tree, separated from the seed by the careful hand of the spice merchant and dried slowly in the warm shadows until it pales to a soft golden orange. From this small annual crop, much smaller than the nutmeg itself, comes the rare and gentler sister spice of the nutmeg jar. The Latin name, macis, may come through Old Greek from a much older Sanskrit word for the lattice of the seed coat, and the small dried lacework has been kept in apothecary cupboards from the Persian markets to the late medieval English kitchens for at least 1,000 years. In the apothecary, dried mace was kept on the middle shelf and used by the careful pinch. A small pinch of the freshly crushed mace was added to warm milk in the long winter evening, to warm wine for the slow cold belly, and to the small careful cold water remedies of the apothecary. The herb was reckoned to be gentler than nutmeg, and a little clearer in its slow warmth, and was preferred for the small and the elderly and the long convalescent. The Italian apothecaries of medieval Genoa kept dried mace in small dark glass vials on the upper shelf, and the records of the great apothecary of Genoa list mace as one of the most carefully purchased of the kitchen spices through the long winters of the late 13th century. The English court physicians of the Tudor period included a careful pinch of mace in many of the slow-warming cordials of the Queen's bedchamber. The herb is the soft sister of the dreaming spice. Let us turn now to the 80th. The 80th is frankincense. It is the dried, tear-shaped resin of a small gnarled tree of the dry Horn of Africa and southern Arabia, with small pale grey leaves and a thick, rough bark, whose careful incisions, made by the hand of the resin gatherer in the dry season, weep slowly through several days a clear, pale yellow gum that hardens, on contact with the air, into the small, fragrant beads of the cupboard. The Greek name, Boswellia, comes from the 18th century botanist Boswell, but the resin itself has been carried by long caravan from the small dry hills of Oman and Yemen to the apothecaries of the Mediterranean for at least 3,000 years. In the apothecary, dried frankincense beads were kept on the middle shelf, and a pinch was carefully placed upon a slow warm coal in the small censer of the herbalist cupboard, where the rising slow blue smoke was breathed in carefully for the slow chest of one troubled by a deep heavy winter cough. A slow tincture of the resin in warm spirit, used by the careful spoonful, was given for the heaviness of the stomach. A salve of the resin in warm beeswax was laid on the slow healing skin of the elderly. The herb has been a faithful companion of the slow chest for many quiet centuries. Let us turn now to the 81st. The 81st is myrrh. It is the dried resin of a small thorny tree of the same dry, hot hillsides of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, with small, pale grey leaves and a deeply furrowed grey bark whose careful incisions, made in the cool dawn of the dry season, weep slowly the cloudy yellow-red gum that hardens to the small dark reddish-brown beads of the cupboard. The herb has been carried by long caravan to the apothecaries of the Mediterranean for at least 4,000 years. In the apothecary, dried myrrh beads were kept on the middle shelf and used carefully. A simple, slow tincture of the resin in warm spirit, used by the careful drop, was given as a mouthwash for the small, slow ulcers within the cheek that follow a long winter of poor bread, for the slow loosening of the gums in the elderly, and as a wash for slow healing wounds. A salve of the resin in warm beeswax was laid on the slow healing skin of the bedridden. The Egyptian embalmers of the New Kingdom prepared their long, careful preservations of the royal dead with myrrh and natron and beeswax, and the small dried beads of the resin have been recovered from the burial chambers of the pharaohs in considerable quantity. The Roman legionaries of the late empire used a careful myrrh wash for the slow healing wounds of the campaign. The herb has long belonged to the careful keeping of the slow body. Let us turn now to the 82nd. The 82nd is aloe. It is the sturdy, succulent perennial of the dry, warm hillsides of East Africa and southern Arabia, with thick, fleshy, spear-shaped leaves arranged in a tight rosette close to the ground, and tall, slender flowering spikes topped with bright orange tubular flowers in the warm season. The thick, almost translucent, slightly bitter clear pulp within the leaf, scraped carefully out with a wooden tool, is the gentle strength of the herb. The Greek name aloe comes through Hebrew from a much older Semitic root, and the herb has been kept in apothecary cupboards from the kitchens of Cleopatra to the small mission infirmaries of 17th century California for at least 3,000 years. In the apothecary, fresh aloe pulp was preferred when it could be had, but in the European cupboards of the cool north only the dried, bitter resin from the leaf was generally available, kept on the middle shelf. A small, careful piece of the dried, bitter resin was used in the long-keeping cordials, and the bright, clear gel of the fresh leaf was applied directly to the slow healing burn of the kitchen, to the small, slow scar of the convalescent, and to the slow, tender skin of the bedridden. The Egyptian queen Cleopatra is said to have kept rows of aloe plants in the cool inner courts of her summer palace at Alexandria, and the dried bitter resin of the leaf was a steady article of trade in the markets of the Mediterranean. By the time Greek soldiers brought home small jars of it from the long campaigns of Alexander, the herb has had for 2,000 years the kindest of long careers. Let us turn now to the 83rd. The 83rd is the rose. It is the woody, thorny shrub of the dry hillside and the cottage garden, with neat, divided, pinnate leaves and the great, fragrant, five-petaled blooms of pale pink, deep crimson, soft white, or pale apricot that have stood at the center of the European garden for at least 2,500 years. Two old roses in particular shaped the apothecary. The damask rose, Rosa Damascena, named for the city of Damascus through which the dried petals so often passed on the long trade route from Persia, and the apothecary's rose, Rosa Gallica, the deep crimson old rose of the small French town of Provins. The petals of these old roses are the strength of the herb. In the apothecary, dried rose petals were kept in linen on the middle shelf. A simple, cool infusion of the dried petals was given for the small, slow heart-fluttering of winter, for the slight queasiness of the stomach, and as a sweet wash for the slow eye of the elderly. A slow conserve of the fresh petals and honey, beaten in a stoneware bowl through several long, quiet hours, was kept in small, dark jars for the convalescent. The distilled rose water of the herbalist was kept in small dark glass on the upper shelf, and a few drops were added to the bath of the heavy-hearted, to the small bedchamber of one troubled by long worry, and to the careful mouth rinses of the apothecary. The Persian apothecaries of medieval Isfahan distilled rose water through the cool nights of spring in great copper alembics. The herb has been a faithful old companion to the heart for many centuries. Let us turn now to the 84th. The 84th is elderflower. It is the broad-leafed, low-growing tree of the damp hedgerow and the cottage edge, with rough green pinnate leaves and broad, creamy white, flat-topped flower heads of small five-petaled blooms in the early summer, ripening by the early autumn into hanging clusters of the small dark elderberries of the country jam. The Old English name, Eleon, has been with the tree for at least 1,000 years. In the country tradition of medieval England and Scandinavia, the tree was reckoned to be inhabited by the gentle spirit Hildemor, the elder mother, and no country woodcutter would lift an axe against the elder without first asking her quiet permission. In the apothecary, dried elderflowers were kept in linen on the lower shelves as the village fever herb. A simple infusion of the dried flowers in hot water, sweetened with honey, was given for the small fevers of the changing season, for the cold settling on the chest, and for the slow chest of children grown weak with a damp winter. A wash of the warm flower water was used for the slow healing skin of the bedridden, and a thin syrup of the warm flowers and honey was kept in stoneware for the long winter coughs. The medieval English country wives kept thick beds of elderflower beside the cottage gate, and the records of the small parish accounts of late medieval Suffolk include the regular purchase of dried elderflowers for the parish poor of winter weeks. The Saxon herbalists called the tree the holy elder, and many a small country charm of the morning was spoken over the gathering of the flowers. The herb has long been kindly to small fevers. Let us turn now to the 85th. The 85th is hawthorn. It is the small, gnarled, deeply thorned tree of the cool meadow edge and the old hedgerow, with neat, small-lobed leaves and broad, creamy white, flat-topped flower heads of small five-petaled blooms in the late spring, ripening by the early autumn into the bright, dark red haws of the country forager's jar. The Latin name crateagus comes through Greek from a much older root meaning the strength tree, for the hard, close-grained wood was used for the small, precious carpentry of the medieval cottage. In the apothecary, dried hawthorn flowers and dried haws were kept on the lower shelves and used carefully. A simple infusion of the dried flowers in hot water was given for the slow heart fluttering of one grown anxious in the long sleepless nights, for the small palpitations of those overworked at the long task of caring for the household, and for the heavy-headed unease of winter. A slow syrup of the dried haws and honey was kept in stoneware for the long winter, and given by the spoonful to the elderly grown weak in the cold months. The Welsh herbalists of the late medieval period, the physicians of Midfi, included dried hawthorn flowers in many of the small, careful preparations of the heart-troubled. The herb has been a quiet companion of the heart for very many small, unrecorded centuries. Let us turn now to the 86th. The 86th is feverfew. It is the sturdy, slightly weedy perennial of the cottage corner and the abandoned wall, with finely cut, light yellow-green leaves and small daisy-like flowers in the high summer, with white petals and a bright yellow center. The whole plant carries a strong, dry, slightly bitter scent that is unmistakable to the country herbalist. The Latin name Tanacetum parthenium, the maiden's tansy, comes from the herb's old reputation as the careful helper of the women of the household. The English country name comes through Old French from the medieval Latin febrifuga, the fever driver out. In the apothecary, dried feverfew was kept in linen on the middle shelf and parted with carefully. A simple infusion of the dried herb in hot water, sweetened with honey, was given for the recurring headaches that come upon some bodies through the long, bright summer weeks, for the small stiffness of the joints of the elderly in the changing weather, and for the slight fevers of autumn. A small fresh leaf, chewed slowly between the teeth, was the country mother's first reach for a stubborn, slow, recurrent headache. A poultice of the warm herb was laid upon the small, slow-healing wound of the kitchen. The English country wives of medieval Devon and Cornwall called the plant featherfew, and the small bunches of the dried herb were hung in the cottage lofts through the long winter. The herbalist sisters of the great Cistercian Abbey of Tintern kept a careful small bed of feverfew in the cloister garden, and the records of the Abbey infirmary in the late 12th century list the dried herb among the regular purchases of high summer. Let us turn now to the 87th. The 87th is meadowsweet. It is the tall, stately perennial of the damp ditch and the cool stream bank, with rough, divided, dark green leaves and broad, creamy white, frothy flower heads of countless tiny blooms in the high summer, and the whole plant carries, when crushed between the fingers, a soft, sweet, honeyed, almond-like scent that lingers long. The English country name, meadowsweet, may come from the herb's old habit of being strewn upon the floors of medieval ale cellars to sweeten the air, or from the broad, sweet flower heads that drift upon the meadow grass like a low, quiet mist. The Latin name Filipendula ulmaria names the plant simply. In the Apothecary, dried meadow sweet was kept in linen on the lower shelves and used widely. A simple infusion of the dried flowers and leaves in hot water, sweetened with honey, was given for the small recurrent headaches that come with the changing weather, for the heaviness of the stomach that follows a too rich summer meal, and for the small slight fevers of spring. A wash of the warm tea was used for the slow tender skin of the elderly. The Welsh chronicle of the early Middle Ages, the Mabinogion, tells the story that the wizard Math, with the help of the magician Gwydion, fashioned a wife for the young hero Llew Law Gyffes from the sweet flowers of 3 meadow plants, and meadowsweet was named first among them for the soft sweetness of its small bloom. The Druid bards of Iron Age Britain are said to have kept dried meadowsweet at their high places of festival, calling it the sweet herb of the summer night. The herb has been a kindly companion of small troubles. Let us turn now to the 88th. The 88th is the willow. It is the slender, often weeping tree of the damp riverside and the wet cottage corner, with long, narrow, silver-grey leaves and small drooping catkins in the early spring. The slim grey bark, peeled in long strips from the small spring branches and dried slowly in the airy lofts, is the strength of the herb. The Latin name, Salix alba, the white willow, has been with the tree for at least 2,000 years. The Greek physician Hippocrates, writing in the 4th century before Christ, recommended a tea of willow bark for the recurring fevers of the swampy country lowlands. The Roman writers continued his recommendation. In the Apothecary, dried willow bark was kept in linen on the middle shelf and used carefully. A simple decoction of the chopped bark in cool water, slowly warmed for an hour and strained through fine linen, gave a deep, bitter, astringent tea that was given in small, careful cups for the small, slow fevers of autumn, for the recurring headaches that come upon some bodies in the changing weather, and for the slow ache of the working back of the elderly. A wash of the warm decoction was used for the slow healing skin of the bedridden. The Cistercian brothers of the damp valleys of Burgundy kept dried willow bark in long linen sacks in the small infirmary, and the records of one Burgundian abbey in the late 13th century list willow bark tea among the regular preparations of the slow spring fevers. The herb's slow, gentle bitterness gave back to many a tired body a small return of ease. Let us turn now to the 89th. The 89th is the white poplar. It is the tall, slender tree of the damp lowland and the marshy edge, with broad oval leaves of a soft silver grey beneath and bright green above, that flutter restlessly in the lightest summer breeze. The slim, pale grey bark, peeled in long strips from the small spring branches and dried slowly in the airy lofts, is the strength of the herb and gives a gentler, milder relief than the white willow. The Latin name, Populus alba, comes through Old Latin from a much older root meaning the people's tree, for the silver-leafed trees were planted in long rows in the cool public squares of the Roman provincial towns. In the Apothecary, dried white poplar bark was kept in linen on the middle shelf, often beside the willow bark, and was preferred for the small and the elderly, for whom the sharper bitterness of the willow was thought a little too strong. A simple decoction of the chopped bark in cool water, slowly warmed for an hour, gave a soft, pale, astringent tea that was given for the recurring fevers of the changing season, for the small, slow ache of the working back of the elderly, and for the slow headaches that come upon some bodies in the long, damp weeks of autumn. The medieval Cistercian brothers of the wet lowlands of Flanders kept dried poplar bark in long linen sacks beside their willow bark. The herb is the gentler sister of the slow river tree. Let us turn now to the 90th. The 90th is juniper. It is the small, dense, evergreen shrub of the cool, dry chalk hillside and the high open mountain pasture, with sharp, narrow, needle-like leaves and the small, dark blue-grey berries that ripen slowly through 2 long years on the female plant. The whole plant, when crushed between the fingers, carries a clean, dry, resinous scent that lingers long, and the small, dark blue-grey berries, when chewed, give a slow, warm, gin-like flavour that is the strength of the herb. In the apothecary, dried juniper berries were kept in linen on the middle shelf. A simple decoction of the crushed berries in warm water or warm wine was given for the heaviness of the stomach, for the small, slow swellings of the legs, and for the cold settling on the kidney of winter rider. A small handful of the dried needles and berries was sometimes slowly smouldered upon a low, warm coal in the small censer of the cupboard, and the rising, clean, dry blue smoke was used to fumigate the small chamber of one returning weak from a long fever in the careful tradition of the medieval plague houses. The herb has been a faithful companion of the cool, slow body. Let us turn now to the 91st. The 91st is the birch. It is the tall, slender, white-barked tree of the damp lowland and the cool, open hillside of the European north, with small, heart-shaped, finely toothed, bright green leaves and small, drooping catkins in the early spring. The thin, papery white bark and the small spring leaves and the slow rising sap of the early year are all small medicines of the northern apothecary. In the apothecary, dried birch leaves were kept in linen on the lower shelves, and the small spring sap was gathered very carefully from a small, slow incision in the bark of the lower trunk in the first warm days of late March. A simple infusion of the dried leaves in hot water was given as a kidney-clearing tea for the slow swellings of the legs, for the slow recurrent troubles of the kidney, and for the small, slow stones of the bladder that trouble many people in the wet seasons. A small, careful cup of the slow spring sap, gathered fresh from the tree, was given as a quiet annual cleansing tonic in the late winter and early spring. The herb is the kindly tree of the northern apothecary. Let us turn now to the 92nd. The 92nd is pine resin. It is the dried, sticky, golden gum of the small, slow incisions in the deeply furrowed bark of the great evergreen pines of the cool northern forest, gathered slowly through several days by the careful hand of the resin gatherer in the dry months of late summer. The slow golden gum, hardened in the warm air to a brittle clear yellow, was kept on the middle shelf of the medieval apothecary in clean glass. In the apothecary, dried pine resin was kept carefully and used in 2 main ways. A small piece of the dried resin was warmed gently in warm beeswax with a little olive oil, and the soft, warm paste was spread upon a clean linen plaster and laid upon the chest of one troubled by a deep, heavy winter cough, where the slow rising warmth and the clean, dry resin scent gave a slow, gentle help to the breath. A slow tincture of the resin in warm spirit used by the careful drop was added to the long-keeping cordials. The herb is one of the kindly slow gifts of the great evergreen tree. Let us turn now to the 93rd. The 93rd is galangal. It is the slender, leafy perennial of the wet lowlands of southern China and Java, with broad, bright green leaves and small clusters of pale flowers held close to the ground, very like its near cousin, the ginger. The fat, knotty, fleshy underground rhizome, lifted slowly in the autumn, is the strength of the herb and gives off, when freshly cut, a sharp, clean, slightly peppery, slightly camphorous scent that lingers long. The Persian name khalanjan came into the medieval spice trade through the merchants of Damascus and Alexandria, and the herb has been kept in the apothecary cupboards of medieval Italy and medieval Germany since at least the 11th century. In the apothecary, dried galangal root was kept on the middle shelf and used carefully. A small pinch of the freshly crushed root was added to warm milk, to warm wine, or to the long-keeping cordials. The herb was used for the cold belly, for the heaviness of the stomach, and as a careful ingredient in the long winter electuaries of the apothecary. The root was reckoned to bring a slow, warm gladness to the long winter heart. The great German abbess Hildegard of Bingen, writing in the 12th century, called galangal the spice of life and recommended a careful pinch in warm milk at the close of working day against the slow heaviness of the northern winter. The herb has been a quiet companion of the slow, cold body of the European north for at least 900 years. Let us turn now to the 94th. The 94th is Asafoetida. It is the thick, yellowish-grey gum of the deep taproot of a tall, sturdy perennial of the dry, rocky lowlands of Iran and Afghanistan, with broad, divided pinnate leaves and tall flowering stems topped with small flat-topped umbels of pale yellow flowers in the late spring. The deep, fleshy taproot, lifted in the cool autumn of the third year, weeps slowly through several days a thick yellowish-grey gum that hardens, on contact with the air, to the small dark brown lumps of the apothecary's jar. The Latin name, Ferula asafoetida, names the plant the strong-smelling fennel, and the herb's old country name, the devil's dung, comes from the deep, sharp, sulphurous, almost garlic-like smell of the fresh resin. In the apothecary, dried asafoetida was kept in stoppered glass on the upper shelf and used by the careful pinch. A small, careful piece of the dried gum was dissolved in warm water with a little honey for the slow, recurrent, colicky belly that troubles some bodies in the long winter, for the stomach of the elderly, and for the heaviness of the body that follows a too rich winter meal. The gum was the colic shock herb of the medieval Damascus apothecaries, and a small piece dissolved in warm water was kept ready in the kitchen for the sudden cramping of the belly that sometimes comes upon a child in the cool morning of winter. The herb is one of the strangest and most respected companions of the cupboard. Let us turn now to the 95th. The 95th is mandrake. It is the strange, thick-rooted perennial of the dry, warm hillsides of southern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean, with broad, rough green leaves in a flat rosette close to the ground, small pale violet flowers in the cool spring, and the small yellow apple-like fruits of summer. The deep, branching, almost human-shaped taproot, lifted carefully in the cool autumn, is the strength of the herb and has been the most respected and carefully handled root of the apothecary for at least 3,000 years. The Latin name, Mandragora officinarum, has been with the plant since the days of Pliny. In the apothecary, dried mandrake root was kept on the highest shelf, behind the iron grate and used by the careful pinch. A small careful piece of the dried root was dissolved in warm wine for the slow sleep bringing of one in deep pain at the close of life, for the slow setting of a difficult bone, and as a careful ingredient in the famous soporific sponge of the medieval surgeons of Salerno, the small linen pad soaked in a slow tincture of mandrake, henbane, opium poppy, and a little hemlock, dried and kept ready to be remoistened with warm water and laid upon the nose of one in need of a slow, careful surgical sleep. The herb has long belonged to the careful keeping of the sleeping body. Let us turn now to the 96th. The 96th is henbane. It is the tall, sticky, rough-leafed annual of the dry, warm bank and the abandoned roadside, with broad, deeply lobed, pale green leaves and large, drooping, dull yellow bellflowers veined inside with deep purple in the high summer. The whole plant carries a heavy, sweetish, slightly fetid scent that is unmistakable, and the herb has been one of the most carefully respected of the medieval cupboard for at least 2,500 years. In the apothecary, dried henbane leaves were kept on the highest shelf, behind the iron grate and used by the careful pinch. A small, careful piece of the dried herb was dissolved in warm water for the slow sleep-bringing of one in deep pain at the close of life, and the herb was a careful ingredient in the famous soporific sponge of the medieval surgeons. A small, careful piece of the dried herb was sometimes added to the slow plasters laid upon a deeply aching tooth. The Pythagorean philosophers of the late ancient world reckoned henbane the dream herb, and the herb has long carried a respected tradition as a slow opener of the inner sight. The medieval apothecaries of the great cathedral towns kept dried henbane behind the iron grate, where the country wife and the curious child could not reach it. The herb has long belonged to the most careful and most experienced of the apothecary. Let us turn now to the 97th. The 97th is black hellebore. It is the sturdy, dark-leafed, low-growing perennial of the damp woodland of southern and central Europe, with broad divided dark green leaves and the famous large white five-petaled flowers, often shaded a soft green at the center, that open in the very depths of winter, sometimes pushing up through the snow in the middle of December. From this surprising winter bloom comes the herb's old country name, the Christmas rose. The Latin name, Helleborus niger, comes through Greek from a much older root, and the herb has been kept in apothecary cupboards from the days of the Greek physician Hippocrates for at least 2,500 years. In the apothecary, dried black hellebore root was kept on the highest shelf, behind the iron grate, and used by the careful pinch. A small, careful piece of the dried root was dissolved in warm wine for the slow purging of the melancholy that sometimes settled upon those grown weary in the long winter, and the herb was the most respected of the careful herbs of the spirit. The Greek physician Hippocrates is said to have used black hellebore in the careful treatment of those whose minds had grown long troubled with the slow weight of seasonal grief. The medieval Salerno school of medicine kept dried black hellebore behind the iron grate, and the records of the school list the herb among the most carefully purchased of winter. The herb has long belonged to the most experienced apothecary and was given only with prayer. Let us turn now to the 98th. The 98th is aconite. It is the tall, slender, dark-leafed perennial of the damp mountain meadow and the cool wood edge of southern and central Europe, with finely cut, deeply divided, dark green leaves and tall, slender spires of large hooded, deep blue-purple flowers in the high summer. The plant has long been the most respected and carefully avoided of the European cupboard, and was the warden's herb kept under the strictest careful keeping of the most experienced apothecary, and never given by mouth. In the apothecary, dried aconite root and dried leaves were kept on the highest shelf, behind a small iron grate fitted with a careful lock, and the herb was used only externally and only by the experienced hand. A slow, careful tincture of the dried root in warm spirit, kept in a dark glass vial, was used by the careful drop, only externally, applied carefully upon the slow ache of the working knee, the slow ache of the cold winter rider's neck, and the slow ache of the field worker's stiff back. The herb was the warden's careful, slow companion, never to be lent. The medieval apothecaries kept dried aconite under the iron lock, that no curious child might find it. The herb is a herb of long, careful respect. Let us turn now to the 99th. The 99th is foxglove. It is the tall, stately biennial of the damp wood edge and the open hillside of Western Europe, with broad, rough green leaves arranged in a flat rosette in the first year, and a single tall flowering stem rising in the second year, hung with the famous large, drooping, tubular pink-purple flowers that are speckled inside, very prettily, with small dark spots. The herb has long belonged to the most experienced apothecary. In the apothecary, dried foxglove leaves were not yet a regular article of the cupboard. The herb is a relative late arrival to the careful European tradition, for the great country physician William Withering of Birmingham, in the closing years of the 18th century, was the first to bring the long folk tradition of the rural Shropshire country wives into a careful written record. The country wives of Shropshire had long given a small, careful infusion of the dried foxglove leaves to those troubled by the slow swellings of the dropsy, and Dr. Withering, observing carefully through 10 quiet years the small, careful dosing of his country patients, brought the herb into the careful written tradition of the modern apothecary. In the late medieval cupboards that included foxglove at all, the dried leaves were kept on the highest shelf, behind the iron grate, and used by the careful pinch, only by the experienced hand, and only for the slow, careful relief of the slow swellings of the dropsied heart. The herb is, like aconite and hellebore and henbane, a herb of long, careful respect. Let us turn now to the 100th. The 100th is the opium poppy. It is the tall, slender annual of the dry garden bed of the eastern Mediterranean and southern Asia, with pale grey-green divided leaves and the great stately four-petaled flowers of soft white, pale pink, deep crimson or pale lilac in the high summer, ripening by the late summer into the great round seed heads of the dried apothecary's jar. The Egyptian apothecaries of the New Kingdom of the second millennium before Christ kept dried opium in small alabaster jars in the inner rooms of the Theban temples. In the apothecary, dried opium, the slow brown gum scraped from the careful incisions made by hand in the green seed heads of summer, was the great quieter, the last herb of the cupboard, the herb that sat beside the small linen pad of the soporific sponge. A small, careful piece of the dried gum was dissolved in warm water for the slow comforting of one in deep pain at the close of long illness, for the slow setting of a difficult bone, and for the careful keeping company of those whose long body had at last grown too weary to bear a slow night in pain. The herb was given only by the experienced hand, and only with prayer, and only to those for whom no other comfort would now serve. There is, in the long, careful tradition of this great quieter, a deep, slow respect that has been carefully kept by the experienced hand for many quiet centuries. The herb has long belonged to the smallest and most careful of all the apothecary's gestures, the laying down at last of the long tired body into a slow, kindly sleep. And so we come, very gently, to the end of the cupboard. We have walked together through 100 herbs tonight, from the small daisy-like chamomile of the Sussex meadow, through the soft pillow herbs of the cottage chamber, the gentle stomach herbs of the kitchen, the cleansers of the spring and the warmers of winter, the kindly companions of the working back and the slow chest, the careful herbs of the women of the household, the slow keepers of the heart, and at last to the great respected herbs of the highest shelf, kept behind the iron grate that belong only to the most careful of the apothecary. There is in the quiet tradition of the medieval apothecary a deep, slow patience that has very little to do with hurry, and a deep, slow kindness that has very little to do with cleverness. The old herbalist by the candle, with the small mortar in one hand and the linen bag of dried flowers in the other, was simply gently paying attention to the slow needs of the body and the slow troubles of the heart, and trusting the small kindly plants of the meadow and the wood and the long trade route to do their slow gentle part in the long passage of the night and the long passage of the season. If your eyes have grown heavy somewhere in the middle of all of this, that is exactly the point. Let them close. Let the names drift away like leaves on a slow stream. There is nothing here that is needed by tomorrow morning, nothing here that asks anything of you. The cupboard will be here when you wake. Sleep well. The apothecary will be back soon with another quiet chapter. The fire is low. The shutters are closed. The small lamp on the workbench is gently turned down, and the linen bags hang quietly from the rafters, waiting for the next slow night.
Good night.